Settle in now. Let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders. Let your hands rest open at your sides and allow the quiet to come. You are exactly where you need to be, and there is nowhere else to go tonight. Nowhere else to be but here, drifting slowly towards sleep on the current of a very old story. A story that has outlasted the empire that tried to contain it. A story that belongs, in some small way, to everyone who has ever longed for open sky. If you find that these stories carry you gently off to sleep, that they become a place you return to each night the way you might return to a favorite room, you are warmly welcome to subscribe, so that each new chapter is waiting for you, whenever the night grows quiet and the mind needs somewhere calm to wander. And if you feel moved, before you close your eyes entirely, you might leave a small comment telling us where in the world you are listening from tonight, because there is something quietly wonderful about knowing that in apartments and farmhouses, and little rooms in countries scattered across the whole turning globe, there are people just like you, breathing slowly, letting the same old story carry them down into rest. You would be joining a very gentle company. But now let us begin. It is late in the last century before the Common Era, somewhere around 70 years or so before the birth of Christ, and the world you are entering is vast and warm, and full of the smell of dust and olive trees. The Roman Republic stretches in every direction from the city at its center, its roads pressing out like the spokes of a great wheel, through mountain passes and river valleys, through thick forests, still dark enough to hold wolves, through coastal plains where the sea wind carries salt and the sharp green smell of wild rosemary. The Republic is not yet an empire, not yet ruled by a single man with a golden wreath upon his head, though that transformation is coming, quietly the way all enormous things come, slowly and then all at once. For now there are consuls and senators, generals and tax collectors, landowners growing impossibly wealthy on the backs of an ever-growing population of slaves, and somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the dust and sweat and roar of the arena, there are the gladiators. You might imagine the arena as you drift, not the great Colosseum which has not yet been built, which is still a century away from rising on its arches of pale stone, but something older and more modest, an oval of wooden stands packed tightly with Roman citizens, with the smell of food being sold by vendors at the edges, with the sharp mineral smell of sand, sand that has been raked smooth and clean for the occasion, sand that will not stay that color for long. The crowd is everything here, restless and various, merchants and freedmen and aristocrats seated according to their station, the noise of them rising and falling like the sound of a great wind moving through a forest. There is lamplight at the edges, when the afternoon grows long, small flames trembling at the perimeters of the space, each one a tiny warmth against the cooling air, and the smoke of them drifts upward in thin pale threads. The gladiatorial games, the munera, have grown from something older and more solemn, from funeral rites, it is said, where combat was offered at the graveside of important men, a gift of blood to honor the dead and ease their passage into whatever came next. By this time, by the last decades of the Republic, they have become something quite different. A spectacle, a political tool, a way for wealthy men to demonstrate generosity and earn the love of the crowd, which is a currency more valuable than silver in a city where the crowd can sway an election or topple a reputation. Politicians sponsor the games. Generals celebrate their victories with them. And so the gladiators become, in a way that is very strange to hold in the mind, both degraded and celebrated, both the lowest of the low and the objects of an intense and complicated fascination. The men who fight are drawn from the furthest edges of the known world. There are Gauls from the cold river valleys of the north, broad-shouldered and proud. There are Samnites from the mountain peoples to the south of Rome who were conquered generations ago, and whose very name was borrowed to describe a class of gladiatorial combat. There are men from the eastern provinces, from Greece and Syria and Egypt, and places whose names the Romans have only recently learned to pronounce. There are condemned criminals who fight not by choice but by sentence, and there are volunteers, actual volunteers, men so desperate or so drawn to the dangerous glamour of the arena that they sign themselves away willingly. And then there are the slaves, taken by war or sold by debt, who arrive with no choice at all in the matter, who wake one morning in chains and go to sleep in a cell, and who are told that this now is their life. The place where they are made into gladiators is called a Ludus, a school, which is a word that carries a certain wry irony because the Latin word for play shares its root with the word for school, and there is very little play in the Ludus, and very little that resembles what we might think of as education. It is more like a kind of relentless shaping, the way a river shapes stone, by constant pressure applied over time, wearing away everything that is soft, until only what is hardest remains. The Ludus has walls, high walls, and a courtyard where the training happens, under the open Italian sky. It has cells, small and bare, with straw on the floor. It has a kitchen and a small infirmary, because the gladiators are an investment, and investments must be maintained, healed when they are broken, so they can be broken again in more profitable circumstances. It has a training master, the doctor, who watches everything with the careful calculating eye of a craftsman, assessing raw material. Beyond the walls of the Ludus, Italy breathes and shifts with the seasons. The hills of Campania, where the most famous of these schools are gathered, are green in spring, with a greenness so vivid it seems almost to hum, dotted with white farmhouses, striped with the silver of olive trees, threaded through with dusty roads where ox carts move slowly toward the market towns. In summer the heat settles heavy and golden, and the cicadas fill the afternoons with their dry mechanical song, relentless and soporific, a sound that could carry you to sleep if you let it. In autumn, the air turns cool at the edges, and the smell of pressing olives and fermenting grapes drifts from every farm, sweet and slightly sharp. And in the winter rains, the hills turn silver gray, and the roads become rivers of pale mud. Through all of it, the seasons turning indifferently overhead, the gladiators train and wait and train again. The life of the late Roman Republic moves around all of this the way water moves around stone. There are elections, scandals, the endless maneuvering of powerful men. There are legions marching out to distant frontiers, leaving behind towns of women and old men and children who wait for news that sometimes never comes. There are slaves everywhere, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The census figures are staggering, and the historians of the period record them with a kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that tells you something important about the world they inhabited. A world in which the unfreedom of a vast portion of its population was simply the background hum of daily life, unremarkable as the wind. And it is the wind you might hold in your mind as you begin to let this story carry you towards sleep. The warm Campanian wind moving through the olive trees outside the high walls of a gladiatorial school, carrying with it the smell of dry grass and lamp oil and the distant sea, touching without judgment the faces of everyone it passes, the senator in his garden, the slave in his cell, the boy not yet born who will one day give his name to a story large enough to outlast the civilization that destroyed him. Tomorrow night, the story takes us further back, before the Ludus, before Italy, before Rome's long shadow fell across a particular hillside in a distant northern land. It takes us to Thrace, to the rolling country where a boy grew up under a wide and windswept sky, and where everything that would later matter began without any sense of its own importance, the way all beginnings do. For now, rest. The wind moves through the olive trees, the small lamps tremble at the edges of the dark. You have found the beginning of a very old story, and the beginning is always the gentlest place to be. The hills of Thrace roll southward toward the sea, like the slow breathing of something ancient and vast, their ridgelines softened by forest and by cloud, their lower slopes threaded with the silver lines of rivers that have no particular hurry about them, moving through meadow and valley as though they too understand that some journeys deserve to be taken without urgency. This is a land of long light in summer, where the afternoons stretch golden and unhurried across fields of tall grass, and of deep winter darkness when the mountains to the north send cold winds sweeping down through the passes, and the world contracts to the warmth of a fire, to the closeness of family, to the sound of voices telling stories in the dark. It is into this land, somewhere in the hill country of the Medi tribe, in the region the Romans would later call Thracia, that the boy who would become Spartacus was born, most likely sometime in the early decades of the 1st century, before the birth of Christ, though the precise year is something no record has preserved for us, lost now in the ordinary silence that swallows the childhoods of those history does not expect to remember. He would have come into the world in a roundhouse of timber and wattle, its roof heavy with thatch, its interior smelling of wood smoke and lanolin, and the particular warm closeness of people living together through a cold season. The fire at the center of it all, as fires always are, giving light and heat and the slow orange comfort that makes darkness feel manageable. The Maedi were a Thracian tribe of some standing in this period, occupying territory in what we might today recognize as the southwestern corner of Bulgaria and the northeastern edges of what is now Greece. Though of course those borders meant nothing then, because the world was organized differently, by kinship and pasture rights, and the memory of where your grandfather's grandfather had grazed his horses. The Thracians as a broader people were not a single unified nation in the way that Rome understood nationhood. They were a constellation of tribes, each with its own customs and chieftains, its own particular dialect and style of ornament, its own relationship to the land and to the gods who lived inside it. But certain things were widely shared among them, and one of those things was a deep and practical relationship with horses, and another was a tradition of warfare that was not merely about conquest or territory, but about something closer to identity, to the way a man understood his own worth and his place among his people. The Thracian landscape itself seems to have shaped this temperament, or perhaps it simply selected for it, rewarding those who could read the terrain, who understood how a hillside could shelter or expose you, how a river crossing could slow an enemy or offer an escape. The hills here are not dramatic in the way of the high Alps or the stark ridges of the Balkans further north. They are gentler than that, but they are also deceptive, their rounded forms concealing ravines and hollow ground, their forests thick enough to lose a column of men in without particular difficulty. A child growing up among the Maedi would have learned this landscape the way children everywhere learn the particular geography of their childhood, not from any formal instruction, but from the accumulated experience of play and work and seasonal movement, from the slow absorption of a world through feet and eyes, and the particular attentiveness that comes from being small in a landscape that is large. It is said that the Thracians had a quality that their neighbors, including eventually their Roman neighbors, found both admirable and unsettling, which was a kind of cheerful indifference to death, a willingness to meet whatever came to them with a directness that could look from the outside like courage, and could look in darker moments like recklessness. Whether this was truly a cultural trait, or whether it was something later writers invented to explain Thracian behavior in battle, is difficult to say from this distance. But what does seem clear is that the world the young Spartacus would have grown up in was one in which physical courage was not merely admired, but was understood as a kind of language, a way of communicating one's place in the community, of earning and maintaining the respect that made a life among one's people possible. The daily rhythms of the Maedi would have been organized around the seasons, as most pre-industrial lives were, with spring bringing the movement of flocks to higher pastures, summer the long labor of cultivation and harvest, autumn the preparation for winter, and the laying in of stores, and winter itself a slower, more inward time, when the fires burned longer and the stories came out. The Thracians kept cattle and horses and sheep, cultivated grain and legumes, hunted the forests for deer and boar, and the smaller creatures of field and hedgerow. Their metalwork was accomplished, their jewelry often beautiful, their weapons well-made and practical, rather than ornate, designed for use in the broken hill country where most of their fighting took place. A boy in this world would have begun learning to ride almost before he could walk with any confidence, the relationship with horses being so fundamental to Thracian life that the two things, childhood and horsemanship, were practically inseparable. He would have learned to handle animals of considerable spirit, because the horses of this region were not the tame beasts of later centuries, but something wilder and more opinionated, requiring a rider who could be both firm and patient, who understood that force alone would not serve, that the animal had to be brought into cooperation rather than simply compelled. This is a lesson that takes years to learn properly, and the learning of it, when it goes well, produces something valuable in a person, a kind of attentiveness to another creature's interior state, a habit of reading mood and intention from small signals, a patience with the slow work of trust. Alongside the horses, there would have been a long education in the use of weapons that was simply part of what it meant to grow up male among the Thracian tribes. The curved blade, known to historians as the rhomphaia, a long, sweeping weapon made for cutting strokes, delivered from horseback, was particularly associated with the Thracians, and younger versions of the curved sika, the short slashing sword, that would eventually become the weapon most identified with the Thracian style of gladiatorial combat, were likely part of a boy's early instruction, not as the formal drilling of a military institution, but as the organic passing of knowledge between generations, father to son, uncle to nephew, elder warrior to watching boy, the way all essential knowledge moved in a world without written curricula. The spiritual life of the Mede, and of the Thracians more broadly, was rich and particular to this landscape, centered on deities and powers whose names and natures are only partially recoverable now. Sabazios, a sky and horseman god associated with thunder and the movements of celestial bodies, was widely revered among Thracian peoples, and Bendis, a goddess of the hunt and the moon, whose worship would later spread even to Athens, had deep roots in this region. The story goes, though it is far from certain, that Spartacus's mother may have been a priestess of one of the Dionysiac cults that were present in this part of Thrace, traditions that involved ecstatic ritual and a close relationship with the wilder, less domesticated aspects of the natural world. Whether this is true or merely a later embellishment, added to make his story feel more mythic, it is a detail that several ancient sources preserved, and it suggests at least that the world he grew up in had room for religious intensity, for the sense that the ordinary world was underlaid by something more potent and less predictable than daily life usually revealed. The fires that warmed these roundhouses in winter, that were carried from place to place as the tribe moved with its flocks, that marked the center of every gathering and every meal, were not merely practical things. They were the point around which community organized itself, the place where the boundary between the family and the night was negotiated every evening, where children fell asleep to the sound of adult voices and the smell of smoke rising slowly toward the gap in the thatch above. In the years before Rome arrived at the edge of this world with its legions and its administrative ambitions and its long memory for tribute, this would have been the constant of a Thracian childhood. The fire at the center, its light flickering on the faces of the people you belonged to, the darkness held just barely at bay. The boy who would become Spartacus grew in this world, absorbing its rhythms and its lessons, its landscapes and its values, until he was old enough to ride and fight and stand among men as someone worth watching. That story, those early years of training and becoming, is where we are headed next, moving gently into the mornings and long afternoons of a Thracian boyhood, following him into the fields and forests before the world grew complicated, while there was still only sky and grass and the patient work of learning what a person's hands and body could do. The hills are still dark when the horses begin to move. It is early, so early that the sky above the ridgeline holds only the faintest suggestion of gray, a softening at the edge of the world that has not yet decided to become dawn. In the valley below the Mede settlement, the river catches whatever light there is and gives it back doubled. A pale silver thread running south through the trees, and the sound of it, that low and constant murmuring over stone, is the first sound a child hears when he wakes in this place. It is the sound of continuity, of water finding its way through the same channels it has always found, the same patience it has always carried, season after season, long before any particular child was born, and long after any particular morning. A boy rises, he pulls a rough wool covering from his shoulders and steps out into the cold. His breath makes a small cloud that dissolves immediately into the greater cold of the air around him, and his feet know the path from the sleeping place to the horses without needing his eyes to lead them. This is what it is to grow up in a place rather than merely to live in it. The body learns the land the way the river learns its banks, by long and patient repetition, by 1,000 mornings just like this one, until the knowledge lives in the feet and the hands rather than in any conscious thought. Among the Mede, the horse was not a tool. It would be too small a word, too Roman a word, to think of the horse that way, as something used and set aside. The relationship between a Mede child and the animal that would become his horse was closer to kinship, something forged over years of shared cold mornings and shared work, of slow trust built through consistency and gentleness and the occasional shared fear. It is said that children among the Thracian tribes began learning to ride almost before they could walk, with any confidence on their own feet. And whether or not that is precise, the spirit of it is true enough. The horse was how you understood the landscape at speed. The horse was how you understood your own body's weight and balance, and the consequences of imbalance. The horse was how you learned that there are forces larger than yourself that can nonetheless be moved in a direction through patience and attention. The boy who would become Spartacus learned these things in the gray pre-dawn light, on ground that was sometimes frozen hard as fired clay and sometimes soft with the mud of recent rain. He learned how to approach an animal that was nervous without making his own nervousness visible. He learned how to settle his weight gradually, how to breathe in rhythm with the breathing of the creature beneath him, how the inside of his knee against a warm flank could communicate an intention more clearly than any sound. These were not lessons given in formal instruction, with someone standing to the side explaining the principles. These were lessons absorbed through doing, through falling and rising, through the patient guidance of older riders who corrected with gesture and example rather than with words. The blade came later, or rather it came alongside, woven through the same years in a different pattern. Among the Medi and their neighbors in the hill country of Thrace, every adult carried a weapon, not as an act of aggression, but as an ordinary and practical feature of life in a landscape that had teeth. The curved Thracian sword, the weapon that would one day, in a Roman arena, become the signature of a fighting style named for these very hills, was first placed in a child's hand simply as a thing that belonged there, the way a carving knife or a leather-working tool belonged in a hand. There was weight to manage and balance to discover. And the elders who guided these lessons had a particular way of watching a child's grip that communicated without speaking, whether the angle was right, whether the shoulder was tense, whether the arm was trying too hard and fighting the weight rather than working with it. The landscape itself was part of the education. The hill country around the Meadi settlements was not gentle. The ridges rose steeply, and the descents could be treacherous in wet weather, and the forests that covered the higher slopes were dense enough that light barely reached the ground beneath in summer. To move through that landscape quickly, quietly, and with awareness, to know which surface would hold under running feet and which would slide, to understand the particular way sound carried in a valley versus along a ridge, to read the sky for weather with the same attention one gave to the ground for tracks. These were skills that no one taught as separate subjects because they were not separate subjects. They were all one subject. The subject was survival and belonging, the knowledge of how to be a living thing in a particular living place. It is said, and the story comes down to us through sources that must be held gently rather than too tightly, that Spartacus showed from early years a quality that the older members of the tribe recognized and watched. It was not simply courage, because courage in some form was expected of everyone, woven into the ordinary fabric of life in the hills. It was something quieter than courage, something more considered, a capacity to observe before acting, to take in the whole of a situation before committing to a single response. The older riders apparently noticed it first on horseback, the way the boy seemed to understand that the horse's hesitation before a slope or a stream was information, rather than obstruction, and that the right response to information was attention, rather than force. This quality would take on an entirely different weight in the years ahead, in circumstances that none of those early morning rides could have predicted. But here, in the gray light of a Thracian hill settlement, it was simply a thing the boy had, part of who he was before history arrived to find a use for it. The seasons turned in the way seasons do in mountain country, with a clarity and force that flatland living does not quite prepare you for. The winters in the hill country of Thrace were serious winters, the kind that drove snow deep into the valleys and kept it there for months, so that the world outside the settlement contracted to a small radius of known paths and covered spaces, with the sound of wind finding the gaps in the walls, and the smell of smoke and wool, and the particular warm smell of animals nearby. These were the evenings of story, of the long oral traditions that carried a people's knowledge of itself forward through time. And a child who listened carefully to those stories was learning something no amount of riding or sword work could teach. He was learning that his people had a past that extended further back than living memory, that they had faced difficulties before and moved through them, that the land they occupied had been contested and won and lost and regained. and that the identity of Aeneid was not fixed to any single moment, but was something carried and renewed. The summers opened everything up again. The high pastures became accessible, and the movement of animals between elevations gave the whole community a kind of seasonal migration, a rhythm of gathering and dispersal that kept the young people moving through landscapes they would need to know. A summer spent at altitude, sleeping rough and learning to read the stars with the same confidence that a settled life reads walls and ceilings, was a different kind of education from anything that happened in the valley, and it left a different kind of mark. All of this, the horses and the blade and the landscape and the story fire and the summer sky, accumulated in a young body and a young mind until they were simply the texture of life, unremarkable to the person living them, the way all deep familiarity is unremarkable from the inside. He did not yet know what he was being prepared for, because he was not being prepared for anything in particular. He was simply growing up in a particular place among particular people, the way water shapes itself to the ground it moves through, taking on the character of the land without effort or intention. Somewhere below the settlement, the river continues its conversation with the stones of its bed, the same patient murmuring it has always made, moving south toward the wider world, carrying nothing but itself and the reflection of whatever light the sky is generous enough to offer. In the valley, in the last hour before the settlement fully wakes, the horses stand quietly in the gray air, breathing slow, their breath rising and dissolving, just as a sleeping listener's breath rises and dissolves now, easy and warm and unhurried. There will be more to tell in the morning. The world beyond these hills is already moving closer, slowly, the way weather moves, and in time, its shadow will fall across even the most sheltered valley. But that is for another night's telling, and tonight the hills are still, and the river runs softly, and the horses dream standing up. The wind comes first, always the wind, rolling down from the high passes before any army does, carrying the smell of iron and leather and the particular dust of thousands of feet moving in formation across dry ground. The people of the Mede knew that wind. They had felt it before, in their grandparents' time and their grandparents' grandparents' time, when other powers had moved through the mountain corridors of Thrace with their banners and their appetites. But the wind that came from the west, in the generations leading up to the birth of Spartacus, carried something older and heavier than anything that had passed through before. It carried Rome. It is worth pausing here in the slow turning of the night to understand what Rome meant in those years, in that age we might call the final century before the Common Era, when the Republic was vast and still hungry and had not yet consumed itself. Rome was not simply a city by then, nor even an empire in the fullest sense of that word, but a great gravitational force pulling everything at the edges of the known world into its orbit. Slowly, inexorably, the way a river in flood does not rush so much as it rises, almost gently, until everything that was dry is no longer dry, and everything that was solid has been softened at its roots. Thrace had always been a borderland. It sat at the edge of several worlds at once, pressed between the Aegean Sea to the south and the Danube to the north, between the Greek cities along its coasts with their marble harbors and their amphorae of olive oil, and the vast Pontic steppe to the east, where the grass ran on without interruption for 1,000 miles. The tribes of the interior, the Mede among them, had lived within this borderland condition for so long that it had become simply the shape of life itself. You managed your relationships with the powerful. You traded when trading was possible, resisted when resistance was necessary, and bent like the tall grass in a high wind, when bending was the only thing that kept you from breaking. The Macedonians had come first, in the great centuries before, and Alexander had marched armies through Thrace on his way to the ends of the earth, and the tribes had felt the weight of that passage without being entirely subsumed by it. After Alexander, the successor kingdoms had quarreled over the region, like dogs over a bone, and Thrace had passed through many hands, while never entirely belonging to any of them, and the mountain peoples in particular, those who lived above the roads and beyond the convenient reaches of any garrison, had preserved something of their own way of life through all of it, the way a seed preserves itself through a hard winter, quiet and compressed and waiting. But Rome was different in its method. if not always in its intention, the Romans did not simply march through. They stayed. They built. They administered. Their armies were not raiding parties or seasonal expeditions, but permanent, self-reproducing institutions. And behind their legions came engineers and tax collectors and magistrates and surveyors, men with measuring tools and wax tablets who looked at a hillside and saw not the home of a tribe, but a resource, a potential, a line on a map that could be drawn more firmly. The Roman presence in Macedonia, which lay just to the west and south of Thrace, had been formalized in the middle part of the 2nd century before the Common Era. And from that base, Roman influence seeped eastward, the way water seeps through limestone, finding every crack and weakness, softening every boundary. The Thracian coast had Roman trading partners and Roman clients among its Greek cities. Roman money flowed through the markets. Roman legal concepts began to reshape the agreements between peoples, and Roman soldiers moved along the roads in numbers that grew year by year with the patient arithmetic of an expanding power. For the tribes of the interior, this did not arrive as a single catastrophic event, but as a slow accumulation of pressures, each one manageable on its own, each one comprehensible as an isolated thing, but together amounting to a transformation so profound that the world a young man knew at 15 was already noticeably different from the world his father had known at 15, and radically different from his grandfather's world. The old ways of raiding and negotiating, of moving flocks between summer and winter pastures along routes that had been used for uncounted generations, of holding council among the elders and settling disputes through established custom, all of these continued, but they continued now within a framework that Rome was gradually building around them, like a wall going up stone by stone while the people inside it went about their daily lives. Conscription was one of the instruments of this slow enclosure. Rome had a long practice of incorporating the peoples it conquered or made clients of into its military structures, sometimes as allies bound by treaty to provide troops, sometimes as auxiliaries attached to legions, men who fought in their own traditional manner, but under Roman command, serving Roman strategic purposes in exchange for Roman pay, and sometimes a path towards something resembling Roman citizenship after long years of loyal service. For a young man from a Thracian tribe, such service could look, from a certain angle, like opportunity. It took you away from the hills, yes, but it put a sword in your hand and coin in your purse, and if you survived, which was not guaranteed, you returned with a knowledge of the wider world that no amount of staying home could provide. But there was another face to conscription, the face that did not look like opportunity at all, the face that looked simply like compulsion. When the balance of power tilted sufficiently, when a tribe's military options were constrained by the proximity of Roman garrisons, when tribute obligations left little room for refusal, when the local chieftains who might have advocated for their people had already been co-opted or neutralized by Roman diplomacy or Roman gold, then military service became something that happened to young men rather than something they chose. They were taken, in the most polite sense of that word, folded into the machinery of Roman expansion and sent to fight in places they had never heard of, in wars that served interests they had no part in shaping. It is said, though the historical record thins considerably when we try to fix specific details to the early life of Spartacus, that he served in some capacity with or alongside Roman forces before his enslavement, that he was for a time a man caught between worlds, Thracian in his formation, but moving through a Roman military landscape, perhaps as an auxiliary, perhaps as a conscript in some looser arrangement. The story is not entirely clear. What the ancient sources suggest, and they are few and fragmentary, is that he was at some point a deserter, a man who left Roman service and returned to his own people, or took to the hills with others in a similar condition, and that this desertion was itself part of what eventually led to his capture. If that is so, then there is something deeply understandable in it, something that requires no elaborate explanation. A man formed in the high country of the Mede, trained from boyhood to read the land as a living thing, to move through it with the freedom of someone who knew its moods and its secrets, would feel the structure of Roman military life as a kind of constriction that went beyond the physical. It was not merely the marching in formation or the digging of trenches and earthworks, though those things were real enough. It was the reduction of a person to a unit, a number in a count, a body directed by orders issued in Latin by men who did not know his name and did not need to, because the system functioned precisely by not needing to know anyone's name. The wind still came down from the high passes in those years, the same wind that had always moved through Thrace, carrying the smell of pine and cold stone and open distance. But increasingly it carried other things too. The dust of legions on the march, the smoke of new roads being cut through old forests, the sound, distant but growing less distant with each passing year, of a world reorganizing itself around a single center, and the people at the edges feeling the pull of that reorganization in ways they had not chosen and could not easily refuse. Somewhere in all of this, in the long, unresolved negotiation between a free life in the mountains and the relentless gravitational demands of Roman power, the young man who was Spartacus moved through his early adulthood, carrying skills honed in a childhood among the Medi, looking at a horizon that was changing shape even as he watched it. The road ahead of him was not yet a Roman road, not yet paved and measured and directed toward a particular destination, but it was narrowing. The hills were still there, still breathing in the wind, and the fires still burned at night in the high encampments, small and warm against the immensity of the dark. The next step on that road, when it came, would change everything. There is a particular quality to the light just before something changes forever, a stillness in the air, a held breath in the grasses, as though the world itself pauses before turning its great wheel another notch. And it is into that kind of light that we arrive now, somewhere on the margins of Thrace and Roman reach, in a season the old stories do not clearly name, in a moment that history records only an outline and aftermath, leaving us to fill the silence with what we know of the land and the time and the man who stood inside it. We do not know the precise circumstances of how Spartacus came to be taken. The ancient sources speak around the edges of it, offering fragments and suggestions rather than a clear and ordered telling. And so we hold what they give us gently, the way one holds a thing found in the earth, carefully, with an awareness that much of it may still be buried. What the story goes is this, that Spartacus was at some point either captured in battle or conscripted into Roman auxiliary service and later deserted, or perhaps both in some sequence that memory has since blurred. What all the sources seem to agree upon is the destination. He ended for a time in Roman hands, and after that, he was a slave. Let that word settle for a moment the way dust settles after movement, slowly, completely, covering everything it touches. To be enslaved in the world of the late Roman Republic was not a single event so much as a process, a gradual narrowing of the world, like a corridor that grows tighter with each step until there is no room left to turn around. First the hands are bound, and the binding is physical and real, rope or iron depending on what was near, depending on how much the captors feared the one they held. Then the name begins to blur. Then the place one came from grows distant, not in miles only but in some deeper way, as though memory itself is being rationed. And then there is the road. There is always the road. Imagine for a moment the world as Spartacus had known it in the days before. The open hillsides of the Medi country, the wide Thracian sky that seemed taller than any sky further south, the particular smell of pine resin and mountain grass on a cool morning, the sound of horses moving through brush in the easy, unhurried rhythm of a land not yet pressed into service. He had moved through that world with the natural authority of someone who understood it, who had been shaped by it, and who had in return shaped himself to its demands. He had known the language of wind in high places, the reading of terrain, the discipline of cold mornings, and the particular pride of a people who had held their valleys against outsiders for generations beyond counting. And then the world narrowed. We cannot know the exact texture of the moment of capture, whether it came in the confusion of a skirmish at some unnamed ford or hilltop, whether there was a last long moment of fighting before exhaustion, or numbers or misfortune tipped the balance, or whether it came more quietly than that, in some negotiation gone wrong, some border crossing misread, some morning that began in one world and ended in another. The ancient writers give us no clear scene to rest in, but we can know this, that for a man of Spartacus's nature and training, the moment the ropes went on would have been one of the most profound experiences a human body can undergo, not only physically, but in some territory deeper than muscle and bone, in that place where identity lives. The Romans who took him would have been practical men doing a practical business, Slavery in the Republic was not personal. A healthy man of fighting age and evident physical capability was not a tragedy to the legionary or the slave dealer or the landowner's agent who saw him. He was a commodity with a clear market value, a set of muscles and a life expectancy, an asset to be assessed and transported and sold. This is one of the harder things to sit with when we move through this story, that the cruelty was so often not hot and intentional but cold and institutional, built into the machinery of the world so completely that those who operated it may have felt no more compunction than a farmer feels loading grain. Spartacus would have been held with others. This is almost certainly true, because the trade in human beings during this period operated at scale, and lone captives were rarer than groups. Prisoners from skirmishes and raids and the steady low-grade friction of Roman expansion moving through the edges of Thrace and the surrounding territories. And so the first new community of his captivity would have been these others, men and perhaps women who had also known other mornings, other skies, other languages spoken around fires that were their own. There is something both terrible and quietly human in that image. Strangers bound together, inventorying each other across the silence for signs of danger or alliance, beginning the slow and necessary work of reading a new social world from inside chains. The holding would have had its own sensory texture, stone or wood or an open enclosure under guard. We cannot know exactly, but we can imagine the particular quality of enforced stillness for someone whose life had been built on movement, on the horse and the trail and the wide open traverse of a landscape that did not pen things in. There would have been sounds at night, the breathing of other captives, the footsteps of guards, perhaps the distant ordinary sounds of a Roman garrison camp going about its evening business, voices calling to one another in a language that was not yet fully understood, fires burning somewhere just beyond the edge of seeing. The fires of a captor look different from the fires of a friend. The warmth is the same, and the light is the same, but the meaning is entirely otherwise. A fire that belongs to someone who holds you is a fire that illuminates your captivity, that shows you the edges of the space you occupy, that keeps itself at a precise and humiliating distance, close enough to see, far enough that it offers nothing. It is said in some of the older accounts that even in his early captivity Spartacus distinguished himself in some way, that there was something about him that drew attention, not necessarily through resistance in those first days, but through presence, through the quality of stillness that very capable people sometimes carry. The kind of stillness that is not submission, but something more like waiting. We cannot verify this, but it is not hard to believe in the way that certain things feel true, even when the evidence is thin, because it fits so precisely with everything else we know of what came later. What is clear is that he survived the holding, and he survived the initial assessment, and he was eventually set upon the road that would carry him further from everything he had known, deeper into the vast and complicated machinery of Rome, toward a fate that the men who bound him could not possibly have imagined when they noted his height and his health and his evident strength and calculated what he might fetch at the right market. He was, by the reckoning of the Republic, a slave now, a piece of property, a body with an economic function and no legal personhood, moving through a world that had thoroughly and efficiently ceased to see him as a man. The Thracian hills were behind him. The open sky was behind him. The language of his people and the names of the rivers he had crossed in childhood and the particular smell of mountain pine on a cold morning, all of it was behind him, growing more distant with every hour, tucked away into some interior space where the Republic could not reach, where memory lives even when everything else has been taken. And the road was ahead, long and dusty and descending toward the south, toward the deep warmth of the Italian peninsula, toward a town called Capua and a place called the Ludus of Lentulus Badiatus, where the next chapter of a life that would eventually shake the Republic was waiting with the patience that stone has always had for fire. But for now, in this quiet telling, we rest here at the edge of departure. The world has narrowed, the chains are on. Somewhere behind, in the dark blue distances of the Thracian hills, a fire that once belonged to free people burns on without him. And somewhere ahead, a different fire. Many fires, in fact, are already burning in the yards of a gladiatorial school, casting their warm amber light across packed earth and high walls, waiting for the footsteps that are still many miles and many days away. Let that fire burn low and gentle at the edges of your thoughts tonight, as you rest, and as the road south begins, slowly in the unhurried way of sleep, to unfold itself toward what comes next. The dust rises before you see anything else. It lifts from the road in thin, pale curtains, stirred by the feet of men and animals moving in a slow, inevitable procession southward through the Italian peninsula, and it hangs in the warm air long after the column has passed, as though the road itself is exhaling, releasing the memory of every traveler who has ever walked this way. This is the Via Appia, or one of the older roads that fed into her, and in the late years of the Roman Republic it was always busy, always groaning with commerce and soldiers and the endless human cargo that empire requires to sustain itself. Grain merchants, military dispatches, provincial governors traveling in curtained litters, tradesmen with their carts of amphorae and cloth, and among them, shuffling along with ankles sometimes chained and sometimes not, groups of men whose lives had recently been taken from them, moving toward a future they could not yet name. Spartacus walked among these groups in these days that followed his capture, heading south. The journey from the northern edges of the empire's reach down toward Campania was not a brief one. It stretched across many days, perhaps many weeks, depending on the route taken and the pace of the party responsible for transporting the slaves, and it passed through a landscape that was in its way beautiful, though beauty is perhaps a difficult thing to attend to when you are walking in chains or close to them, when your wrists bear the memory of rope or iron, when each step carries you further from everything you have known. Still the land was there, indifferent and quietly magnificent, and for a man shaped by the open hills of Thrace, accustomed to reading landscape the way others read language, it is reasonable to imagine that some part of Spartacus noticed it, even in those first numb and grief-darkened days of captivity. The central spine of Italy ran through the country like a long, slow breath. The Apennine Mountains rising and falling on either side of the roads, their slopes covered in oak and beech that in the autumn would have burned gold and amber against the pale sky, and lower down, where the hills gentled toward the valley floors, there were vineyards already stripped of their grapes for the season, and olive trees with their silver leaves catching the light in small, restless flickers. The Italian countryside in this period was a cultivated thing, worked and ordered in a way that the wilder parts of Thrace were not, and the roads cut through it with the particular confidence of Roman engineering, straight where possible, banked and drained, paved in sections with large flat stones that rang under hobnailed sandals and the iron-shod wheels of carts. The sound of that road, that rhythmic, hollow striking of foot upon stone, would have followed the column for hours at a time, a kind of percussion underlying everything, marking the slow southward progress of the days. They would have stopped at waypoints, at roadside inns called tabernae or mansiones, where the men responsible for the convoy could eat and rest, and where the slaves under their charge would be watered and fed the minimum necessary to keep them moving. The food at these stops was simple and rough: bread, perhaps some olives, a thin soup of whatever legumes or grains were available. Water came from roadside fountains fed by the great aqueducts that Rome had stretched across the land. And if the water was sometimes warm from its long journey through stone channels in the sun, it was still water, still clean enough. And a man who was thirsty from a long day's walk did not trouble himself about its temperature. At night the column would rest, sometimes in the walled yard of an inn, sometimes in a field beside the road when no shelter was available. The stars above Italy were thick and close in those nights before the burning of 1,000 modern lights, and it is said that men new to the Italian sky sometimes found it startling how different the constellations appeared when viewed from a different latitude. The familiar patterns of a northern childhood shifted just slightly, as though the sky itself had been tilted a few degrees. Whether Spartacus looked up at those stars and thought of Thrace, of the hillsides where he had run as a boy, of the people he had been taken from, all of this lies beyond the edges of what the record can tell us, and so we leave it gently, as an open space, as a silence that the night could fill. As the column moved further south, the air began to change. Italy south of Rome grew warmer, more humid, carrying a richness that the drier northern air did not have. the smell of volcanic soil, which is exceptionally fertile, and of the sea, which on the western side of the peninsula was never very far away. The region of Campania, which they were approaching, was considered among the most productive and pleasant in all the known world. Its fields produced wheat in abundance, its slopes were heavy with vines, whose wine was prized across the empire, and its cities were old and prosperous, and layered with the accumulated culture of centuries. Capua in particular, their destination was one of the great cities of southern Italy, sitting on the flat Campanian plain with the confidence of a place that had been important for a very long time, its streets busy with commerce, and its population a complex mixture of Roman citizens, Italian freedmen, immigrants from across the Mediterranean, and the enslaved people who did much of the work that kept all of it running. It was in Capua, in a district where the city's noisier and more marginal industries clustered, that the establishment of one Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus operated. His school, the word in Latin being Ludus, which carries the strange double meaning of both school and game, as though the Romans understood something about the relationship between learning and play, or perhaps between suffering and entertainment, was one of several gladiatorial training facilities that existed in Capua at this time, and the city had a particular association with the training of gladiators that stretched back generations. There was something about Campania, about its combination of wealth and appetite for spectacle, that made it a natural home for this industry. Batiatus himself is a figure who appears in the historical record only in outline, a name attached to a school, attached to a rebellion, and the story goes that he was a man of business before he was anything else, a lanista, which was the title given to men who bought, trained, and rented out gladiators for the games. It was a profession that occupied an interesting and uncomfortable position in Roman society, profitable, even very profitable, and yet considered somewhat disreputable, associated with the buying and selling of lives, with violence made into commerce. That discomfort does not seem to have troubled men like Batiatus especially deeply. There was money to be made, and the games were popular, and someone had to supply the fighters, who made the amphitheaters roar. When the column finally reached Capua, after all those long days of road and dust and stars, and the rhythmic striking of stone underfoot, it would have entered through one of the city's gates, in the ordinary way of things, unremarkably, as convoys of slaves arrived regularly in cities throughout the empire. The streets inside the gate were busy, and smelled of bread and animals and charcoal from the braziers of street food sellers, and somewhere in that sensory press of an unfamiliar city, the men were sorted and assessed, and those destined for the Ludus were separated from the others and taken to their new quarters. The building they entered would have had high walls, all Ludi did, thick, solid, capable of keeping people in, as well as keeping the curious out. There would have been a central courtyard of packed earth, training equipment, the smell of sand and iron and sweat, baked into the stone by countless days of use. There would have been the sounds of other men, voices in several languages, the clatter of practice weapons, the distant rhythm of feet on training ground. And underneath all of it, if you were quiet enough to hear it, if you pressed your hand to the wall of that place and listened, you might have felt the particular tension of men living under constraint, of strength being both developed and contained, of fire being asked to burn within very specific limits. Spartacus had arrived at the Ludus of Batiatus. He was inside now, and the walls were high, and the days ahead would be governed by a new and rigid rhythm. But he had walked a long road to get here, and men who have walked long roads carry something within them, a knowledge of distance, a patience with slow things, a capacity to hold a direction in mind, even when the ground underfoot is difficult. For now the night comes down over Capua, soft and warm with the particular warmth of Campanian evenings, and the lamps inside the Ludus begin to glow, one by one, small and steady in their iron brackets on the stone walls, casting their light into the corners of this new and confining world. The darkness before dawn in Capua is a particular kind of darkness, not the soft country dark of open fields and breathing earth, but a close, walled dark, a darkness that smells of turned soil and old iron and the slow exhalations of many sleeping men packed together in a space designed not for comfort, but for containment. The stars, if you could see them from within the courtyard, were the same stars that had always burned above the hills of Thrace, above the plains of Macedon, above the curved shores of the wide Mediterranean. And yet from here, framed by stone walls and the black geometry of the Ludus roof, they seemed somehow smaller, somehow more distant, as though the sky itself had been subdivided and rationed along with everything else. This is the world of the gladiatorial school, the Ludus, and if you let yourself simply rest inside it for a little while, not as a prisoner, but as a quiet observer drifting through its hours the way lamplight drifts through a half-open door, you will find that it has its own rhythm, its own texture, its own strange and particular beauty, buried beneath all the hardness. The cells where the men slept were small, each one just wide enough for a straw pallet and a body, each one fitted with a door of iron bars through which the night air moved with a sound like the turning of pages in a very slow and very ancient book. The men who slept here had come from everywhere, from Gaul with its deep forests and its cold rivers, from the eastern shores of the Black Sea where the wind carries salt and distance, from the sun-hammered coasts of North Africa where the sand holds heat long after dark, and from the green, wind-trembling hills of Thrace. They had come by different roads and through different losses, but they slept now under the same roof and breathed the same Campanian air, which in autumn carries the faint volcanic sweetness that rises from the deep earth beneath this part of Italy, as though the land itself is always quietly at work below the surface of things. The first sound of morning in the Ludus was not a voice or a bell, but a door, the great wooden door of the supply room at the far end of the training yard, which had developed over years a particular low groan as it swung on its hinge, a sound that the sleeping men registered even before consciousness returned to them fully, a sound that the body knew before the mind did. Then came the sound of the water carriers, the slaves who served the school, moving through the yard with their ceramic amphorae, and the liquid sound of water being poured into the long stone troughs along the eastern wall. And this sound, clean and cool and unhurried, was perhaps the most genuinely peaceful moment in the entire long day. Those few minutes in the gray pre-dawn, when the water ran and the men stirred in their cells and the sky above the open courtyard shifted from black to the deep blue of a mussel shell. The training yard itself was the heart of the Ludus, and it would be easy to see it only as a place of violence, but to rest your gaze upon it in the early morning, before the day's work had properly begun, was to see something that looked almost like any other place where skilled men practice a difficult craft. The sand had been raked smooth by the time the men emerged, and it held the raking marks in long, even ridges, the way a calm sea holds the memory of a light wind. And the wooden training posts, the pali, which stood as tall as a man and were planted deep in the sand, cast long westward shadows in the first horizontal light. The walls of the yard were pale ochre in the morning, the color of old honey or the dusty limestone of the Campanian hills, and along the top of the walls, where the guards stood their watches, the light caught the iron of their spear tips and made small bright sparks that moved slowly as the men moved, pacing, unhurried in the way that guards pace when nothing has happened and nothing is expected to happen. The smell of the Ludus was layered and complex, in the way that only enclosed human spaces become over time. There was the smell of the sand, which held within it the minerals of the earth, and also something else, something iron-edged that the sand absorbed and never quite released. There was the smell of the cook fires, which had begun in the kitchen building before the sky was fully light, and which sent a thread of olive wood smoke across the yard that was, whatever else it meant, the smell of warmth and the promise of food. The men were fed twice a day, in the morning after the first training session, and again in the evening before the cells were locked, and the food was simple and substantial. Barley and wheat porridge, beans cooked soft with oil, dried figs, occasional portions of dried meat or cheese. It was the food of men being maintained, being kept strong for a purpose, and it was eaten in the yard, on low wooden benches, in a silence that was not the silence of shame, but the silence of hunger, honestly attended to. The doctores, the trainers, moved through the yard with the easy authority of men who knew their work and had been doing it long enough that they no longer needed to raise their voices to be heard. Each doctor was responsible for a particular style of combat, and each carried himself with the particular pride of a master craftsman, because that, in the strange and specific economy of the Ludus, is precisely what they were. The wooden swords they used in training, the Ludus, had a sound when they connected with shield or post that was less a crack than a thud, a dense absorbed impact sound that carried across the yard all morning like a slow and irregular heartbeat. Over and under that rhythm came the breathing of the men, controlled, measured, the breath of effort directed inward rather than released into noise. Water was everywhere in the daily life of the school, not in abundance but in careful sufficiency, in the morning troughs, in the large ceramic jars placed at the corners of the yard for the men to drink from during rest periods, in the baths at the rear of the complex, where the men went at the end of the day's training to wash the sand and oil and effort from their bodies. The bathhouse was the one room in the Ludus that was not defined by hardness. Its walls were plastered and painted in faded ochre and terracotta. Its floor was warm from the hypocaust beneath it, and the water in the plunge pool moved with a slow, mineral calm that seemed to exist slightly outside the rhythm of the rest of the day. It is said that men spoke more freely in the baths than anywhere else, that the warmth in the water loosened something that the yard's watchfulness kept tightly wound, and that the conversations held there, half-whispered in the steam, were quieter and more honest than any others the Ludus permitted. The evening settled over the school slowly, the ochre walls cooling to gray, the shadows in the courtyard lengthening and merging until the yard was one continuous shadow, and then the lamps were lit. Small terracotta oil lamps hung on iron hooks along the corridor walls, casting a warm, unsteady light that moved with every breath of air from the street outside. In that lamplight the men returned to their cells, and the sound of the barred doors closing was a sound each man had learned to hear without flinching, a sound that meant the day was done, that the body could rest, that whatever the morning would bring, it had not yet arrived. Through the bars of the cell doors the lamplight came in slanted columns across the stone floor, and the shadows of the bars lay across the sleeping pallets like the markings of a sundial, measuring out the night in their slow, imperceptible turning. The Ludus at night was almost tender in its stillness. The guards spoke to each other in low voices on the walls above, their conversation too distant to be understood, just the murmur of it drifting down into the yard where the raked sand held its shapes undisturbed in the dark. The men in their cells lay in the postures of the genuinely tired, the postures of men whose bodies had been worked to their honest limits and now required only rest to restore themselves to readiness. Outside the walls of the school, the city of Capua continued its nighttime business, a cart on the stone street, a door closing somewhere, the distant sound of a dog in a garden. But inside, the breathing of many sleeping men rose and fell together in something very close to peace. And it was in this place, in this daily rhythm of sand and water and lamplight, and the long, regular work of becoming formidably skilled at something that had not been chosen, that the men who lived here were slowly, without entirely realizing it, becoming something more than gladiators. Tomorrow, in the quiet hours between the morning water and the first strike of wood on wood, we will begin to follow the particular path of one man through all of this, the way he moved through the training, the reputation he was quietly building, the quality of attention he brought to everything he did. But that is a story for when the night has settled a little more, and the lamplight has burned a little lower, and the breathing has grown easier and slow. The smell of the training ground in early morning was something you did not forget easily. Dry earth and iron, and the faint char of last night's torches still hanging in the still air of the courtyard, the stone walls holding the darkness a little longer than the sky above them, which had already begun to pale at its edges with the first gray suggestion of a coming day. Before the men were roused, before the wooden weapons were lifted from their racks, and the doctores called out their first sharp instructions across the sand, there was this brief and fragile quiet in the Ludus at Capua, this suspended moment when the world held its breath between night and the long labor of the hours ahead. It was into this daily rhythm that Spartacus was now absorbed, drawn into it the way a stone is drawn down through water, settling slowly into a new and alien element. The life of a gladiatorial school was unlike anything the Thracian hills had prepared him for. Not because it lacked discipline. The Mede tribe had known discipline, the discipline of seasons and survival and the long patience of the hunter, but because this discipline was pointed so precisely, so deliberately, at a single and terrible end. Everything that was learned here was learned in the service of spectacle. Every skill refined was refined so that it might be displayed and spent, and if fortune was unkind, extinguished before the roar of tens of thousands of watching faces. And yet the skills themselves were real. That was the thing one came to understand slowly, moving through the early weeks of training when everything ached, and the wooden practice sword felt simultaneously too light and impossibly heavy, when the stances seemed unnatural and the movements foreign. The discipline of the Ludus was genuine. The doctores, the trainers who walked the sand in the hours between sunrise and the midday rest, correcting, demonstrating, striking at a misaligned shoulder or an improperly weighted foot with their own short staves. These men knew their craft with a deep and unsentimental precision. They had seen bodies break in the arena. They had watched men die for small errors of footwork repeated until they became habit. They caught with the authority of those who understood exactly what failure cost, and they did not soften what they knew. For Spartacus, those early weeks unfolded as a kind of second childhood, a relearning of things he had thought he understood. He had fought before, had grown up among warriors, had ridden and hunted and trained in the ways of the Mede, but fighting in the Thracian manner and fighting as Rome required of its gladiators were different arts, and the difference was not merely technical, it was philosophical. In the hills of Thrace, combat was a matter of terrain and opportunism, of reading the land and the weather and the movements of men across open ground. Here the arena was a closed world, a circle of sand bounded by stone, and everything within it was performance, as much as it was war. The crowd was always part of the equation. The angle at which a man turned to deliver a blow, the timing of a feint, even the way a wound was received, all of it was shaped by the knowledge that eyes were watching, that judgment was being rendered not only by an opponent, but by the gathered thousands who had come to consume what they could not themselves perform. Spartacus absorbed these lessons with a quality of attention that the doctores noticed, and it is said remarked upon among themselves. He was not the fastest among the trainees, nor the strongest. There were men in the Ludus, particularly among the Gauls and the larger Germanic fighters, who possessed a raw physical power that exceeded his. But he had something that was perhaps rarer, a capacity to observe and to integrate, to watch a technique demonstrated once or twice, and understand not just the shape of it, but the logic beneath the shape. He asked questions that were not common among newly arrived men, not the desperate or the defiant questions of the frightened, but careful questions about why a particular guard position offered what the doctor claimed it offered, why the angle of approach in one scenario differed from another seemingly similar one. He learned, one felt, the way a craftsman learns, with genuine curiosity about the principles of the thing. His assignment as a Thrace, a fighter in the Thracian style, made a kind of practical sense, and there is something quietly affecting about the symmetry of it. That Rome, having taken him from Thrace and made him property, would then hand him a curved Sicca blade and a small round shield and ask him to perform, for Roman entertainment, a version of the fighting tradition of the very people he had come from. The Thrace style suited him. The curved blade rewarded the qualities he already possessed: quickness, agility, a preference for movement over static confrontation. The small shield, the parmula, required a fighter to generate his own protection through positioning, rather than hiding behind a broad defensive surface. And this too aligned with the way Spartacus moved through space, economically, always thinking 2 positions ahead, never quite where an opponent expected him to be. The sand of the training ground was raked each morning before the session began, and by its end it bore a record of the day's work. The scuffed and circling patterns of footwork, the deeper gouges where a man had lunged or stumbled, the occasional dark stain that dried quickly in the Italian sun and was raked away again before the following morning, as if the ground were quietly forgetting what it had witnessed. Spartacus moved across this sand day after day, and the patterns his feet left grew more deliberate over the months, more economical, the circles tighter and more purposeful, the footwork resolving gradually from something learned into something lived. His sparring partners changed as he advanced through the levels of the school's informal hierarchy. Early sessions were against other newer men, some of whom were frightened and overcautious, some of whom were reckless with the false confidence of the newly proud. Later he was matched against men with more years in the Ludus, men who had already stood in the arena and carried in their bodies the specific knowledge that comes only from that experience, the knowledge of what it means when the practice stops and the real thing begins, when the blade is no longer wooden and the sand below has the potential to receive you permanently. These men fought with a quality of seriousness that was different in texture from mere aggression, and training against them changed Spartacus in ways that were difficult to articulate, but visible to those who watched carefully. A reputation grew around him quietly, the way reputations tend to grow in closed communities where men live in close proximity and observe one another constantly, and have little else to occupy the long hours of evening after the day's training ends and the lamps are lit in the small cells along the corridor. He was not a man who sought admiration or cultivated followers in any obvious way. He did not boast of his performance or position himself loudly within the social hierarchies that formed naturally among the gladiators, those alliances of origin and language and fighting style that shaped the invisible map of the Ludus's interior life. He was, by most accounts, quieter than his skills might have led one to expect, observant in company, sparing with his words in Latin, which he was learning with the same methodical care he brought to the blade. But the quietness was not absence. It was a particular quality of presence, the presence of a man who is always somewhere within himself, watching and thinking, receiving more than he sends out into the world around him. The other men felt it without always being able to name it. They noticed that Spartacus listened when others spoke, that he remembered what was said, that he appeared to be constructing from the fragments of daily life some larger picture that only he could see in full. Whether this was the natural cast of his character or something sharpened by the circumstances of his captivity, the internal turning of a man who has had his outer freedom taken and so has retreated into an inner landscape that no one can reach. It is impossible to say with certainty now, across all these centuries of distance. The lamps along the corridor burned low in the late evening, their small flames steadying as the air inside the Ludus settled into the particular stillness of a place where exhausted men sleep deeply, dreamlessly, their bodies spent by the day's hard work. The smell of oil and warm stone and cooling sand drifted through the passageways, and the torches in the courtyard outside threw their pale amber light against the walls in slow and steady patterns that barely moved at all. Spartacus lay in the darkness of his cell, and the relationships forming in the shadows around him, friendships and alliances and the slow accumulation of shared understanding, were beginning, without any of the men involved quite knowing it yet, to take on a shape that went beyond the ordinary fellowship of men who simply endure the same difficult life together. There is a particular quality to the air inside the Ludus in the hour just after the evening meal, when the training yard has emptied and the lamps have been lit along the corridor walls, each small flame casting its wavering circle of amber light against the stone, making the shadows between the circles seem deeper and more private than they truly are. It is in those shadows, in those narrow spaces between one pool of lamplight and the next, that the real life of the gladiators moved and breathed and slowly took on shape. Not the life of the arena, not the performance of violence that the Lanista sold to the crowds, but something quieter and more lasting, the life of men who had found one another in a place designed to keep them apart. It is worth resting for a moment in that thought, feeling the weight of it settle gently. A gladiatorial school was, among other things, an exercise in controlled isolation. The men who trained within its walls were valuable property, expensive investments, and the logic of the Ludus demanded that they remain separate from one another in the ways that mattered most, separate in loyalty, in solidarity, in the shared language of grievance and hope. A gladiator who felt himself part of a brotherhood was a gladiator who might one day act like one. And so the structure of the place, its schedules, its hierarchies, its careful allocation of small privileges and smaller comforts, worked always and quietly against the formation of exactly the kinds of bonds that human beings, under any circumstances, cannot help forming with one another. And yet they formed. They always form. That is one of the quieter truths that history keeps offering, if we listen to it in a gentle enough register. Crixus came from Gaul, from the long green country to the north and west where the rivers ran cold, even in summer, and the forests pressed close to the edges of every settlement. He was a large man, strongly built, with the kind of physical presence that a room feels before it quite sees. and it is said that in the training yard he carried himself with a particular intensity, a focus that bordered on ferocity, as though the work of becoming a better fighter was the one thing the world had left him that he could fully claim as his own. He had arrived at the Ludus of Lentulus Batiatus at Capua some time before Spartacus, the story goes, and had by the time of our central years already established himself as one of the school's most capable and formidable students. The trainers noted him. The other gladiators noted him. He was not a man who passed unremarked. Oenomaus, too, was Gallic, though the ancient sources are not always careful about the precise distinctions between the various peoples Rome gathered under that broad northern name, and it is possible that he and Crixus came from different tribes, different traditions, different memories of home. What seems to have drawn them together, and what eventually drew Spartacus into their orbit, was something harder to map than geography or shared origin. It was, in the way that these things always work, a matter of recognition, the slow, quiet process by which certain people in certain places look at one another across the ordinary distances of daily life and understand, without needing to say so directly, that they are seeing something true. The lamplight in the sleeping quarters would have burned low by the time the day's rations of speech and silence had been distributed and spent. And in that low light the three men, Spartacus the Thracian, Crixus the Gaul, Oenomaus, whose origins the record blurs a little, would have found themselves returning again and again to the same proximity, not conspiring yet, not planning, not even necessarily articulating to themselves or one another what it was that hummed beneath the surface of their conversations. Just present to one another, just real to one another, in a place that worked very hard to make men feel unreal. There is something to be said for that simplest layer of the story, the one that needs no grand political or military frame to hold it. These were men far from home, sleeping on tallets in a stone building, in a city that was not theirs, training each day for a form of entertainment built on their suffering. And in that condition they did what human beings do. They talked. They listened. They noticed which of the men around them spoke with honesty and which with performance, which carried their fear openly and which buried it so deep it came out only as anger. They learned each other's habits and silences. They extended, carefully and without ceremony, the small gestures of regard that in such a place constitute an extraordinary generosity. It is said that Spartacus had by this period already earned a particular reputation within the Ludus, not only for his physical capability in the training yard, but for something in his bearing, a quality of attention, of thoughtfulness, that distinguished him from the simple arithmetic of violence that surrounded him. The ancient sources, writing long after the events they describe, speak of him with a certain wondering puzzlement, noting that he seemed to them too measured, too intelligent, too humane for the category they wished to place him in. We might smile gently at that puzzlement, recognizing it for what it is. They were surprised to find depth in a man they had already decided was a lesser thing. Spartacus, for his part, simply continued being what he was. What he was, increasingly, was a node of trust in a place where trust was both desperately needed and extremely dangerous. Men came to him with small things, a question about technique, a worry about an upcoming pairing, the wordless need simply to be heard by someone who would not use what they said against them. And through those small approaches, through the ordinary texture of days spent in one another's company, the shape of something began to emerge that was larger than any of its individual parts. Crixus brought fire to that shape, a directness and a physical boldness that could move other men, that could make the idea of action feel less like a dream and more like a road with a first step. Oenomaus brought steadiness, the story goes, a quality of careful observation that complemented both Crixus's intensity and the more contemplative register of Spartacus himself. They were not alike, these three, and that was perhaps part of the strength of what grew between them. They fit together at the edges, filling in each other's silences, offering each other the kinds of courage that each could not quite manufacture alone. The gladiators who came to trust them, and who would eventually follow them, were a varied company, men from across the wide geography of Rome's appetite for conquest and slaves, Gauls and Thracians and Germans, and others whose homelands the ancient record does not specify, men who had been soldiers and shepherds and farmers, men who had known freedom, and men who had been born into bondage, men who had forgotten what it felt like to walk through a doorway of their own choosing. What they shared was the daily reality of the Ludus, the training and the watching and the careful management of hope. And what they found in the constellation of Spartacus and Crixus and Oenomaus was something that the structure of that place was never supposed to permit them. They found the sense that they were, together, something more than the sum of their individual captivities. The lamplight along the corridor walls would gutter sometimes in the drafts that moved through the building at night, each small flame bending and then recovering, bending and recovering, as though breathing. In those moments of brief dimming, the shadows between the light pools would deepen and then ease again, and the murmur of low voices would continue beneath the returning amber glow, patient and persistent and alive. Nothing had been decided yet. No plan had been laid. The escape that would in time become a legend, the flight to the slopes of the mountain to the south, the gathering of thousands, all of that still lay somewhere beyond the present moment, folded into a future that none of them could see clearly. But the foundation of it was here, in these evenings, in these careful recognitions, in the slow building of a trust that the walls of Capua were not, in the end, strong enough to contain. Let that thought rest with you now, soft and unhurried. The friendships have been made. The men who will carry the story forward have found one another in the lamplight and the shadow. There is no urgency in it yet, only the warm and quiet fact of human connection forming in the dark, like something growing toward a light it cannot yet see but already somehow knows is there. The little flames along the corridor walls burn on through the night, steady now, the drafts having passed, each one holding its small circle of warmth against the surrounding stone, patient as everything is patient, when it is waiting, without quite knowing it yet, for morning. There is a particular quality to silence inside stone walls at the third hour of the night, when the lamps have been reduced to their lowest breath, and the guards have settled into the slow, nodding rhythm of men who believe nothing can happen until morning. The silence is not empty. It is full of the small sounds that stone buildings make when they cool. The faint tick and settle of walls contracting. The whisper of air finding its way through gaps that were never meant to be there. The distant shuffle of a man turning in his sleep on a thin mat on a harder floor. And underneath all of that, if you were to press your ear very gently against the fabric of those particular nights in the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus, you might have heard something else entirely. The low, careful movement of voices that were trying very hard not to be voices at all. The conspiracy that would eventually crack the world open like a split stone did not begin with a dramatic declaration or a moment of sudden fire. It began as most true and desperate things begin, in the margins, in the half-sentences exchanged during the walk from the training yard back to the cells, in the pressure of one hand on another man's forearm that communicated something no word could safely carry, and the slow gathering of understanding between men who had learned, first and foremost, how to read the intentions of other men without appearing to look at them at all. These were gladiators, after all. The reading of bodies, of weight shifts and hesitations, and the microgeography of a face was not merely a skill they had developed. It was something closer to a second language, one that required no alphabet and left no record that could be found and used against you. It is said that the plan began to take its first real shape among a small number of men, Spartacus, certainly, and Crixus the Gaul, and the older Oenomaus, whose experience and steadiness gave weight to everything he touched. There were others whose names the ancient sources do not preserve for us, men who would have been present in those hushed conversations, and who perhaps carried portions of the plan that the others could not, men who never received the credit that history tends to reserve for the figures it can name. The story of the conspiracy is, in this way, also the story of how much is lost when only the broad outlines survive. What they were planning was not simply an escape. An escape was something a single man might attempt alone, slipping away in the confusion of a supply delivery, or bribing a guard with promises that could not be kept. What took shape in those whispered hours was something more ambitious and more fragile and more dependent on trust than almost anything these men had attempted before, even in battle, in their various ways and from their various parts of the world, known battle. They were planning to move together, to overwhelm rather than slip away, to use the very skills the school had honed in them as the instrument of their own liberation. There is something almost unbearably poignant about this when you turn it over quietly in your mind, that the training designed to make them useful and profitable and lethal on behalf of their owners would become in the end the precise tool of the owner's undoing. The details had to be arranged without paper, without any physical record, entirely within the architecture of memory and trust. Who among the guards grew inattentive and at what hour? Which doorways were locked with chains, and which with simple bolts that could be forced? Where the kitchen implements were stored, knives, cleavers, the long iron spits used for roasting, and whether they could be reached before any alarm was sounded. The story goes that kitchen tools were indeed a significant part of the original plan, chosen because they were available in a way that the school's actual weapons were not, kept as those were under conditions of much greater security. There is something both brutal and oddly domestic about this detail, something that speaks to the reality of what these men were working with, not the gleaming instruments of the arena, but the rough iron of the cooking fire. And the cooking fire itself, the low amber pulse of it in the kitchens where food was prepared for the school's population, the way it threw its light against the stone and then withdrew it, throwing and withdrawing all through the long watches of the night. This was perhaps what they gathered around in their imagination when the planning grew difficult and the weight of what they were attempting pressed in on all sides. Fire as warmth, fire as the oldest companion of people who had known open skies and open fires long before they knew these walls. Fire as something that could not be chained. The fear that moved through the conspiracy was real, and it was constant, and it would be wrong to imagine otherwise, to smooth it away in the interest of a cleaner story. These were men who understood with absolute clarity what the consequences of discovery would be. They had seen what Roman law allowed to be done to slaves who rebelled, or even planned to rebel. The terrible and public nature of the punishments designed not merely to end a specific threat, but to teach a lesson to every watching eye. They carried this knowledge with them into every whispered conversation, every careful look, every moment when someone new was considered for inclusion, and the question had to be asked and answered without words. Can this person be trusted with something that could kill us all? The number who were ultimately involved in the escape plan is a matter some ancient sources place at around 200, though others suggest the original conspirators were a smaller group still, with the full numbers only joining the flight once it was already in motion. It is said that at some point before the escape, the plan was betrayed, that someone spoke to someone who should not have been spoken to, and that word reached Batiatus or those close to him, and that the window of safety began to close. This is the detail that gives the story much of its urgency, though urgency is not quite the mood for tonight. What matters in the slow and gentle consideration of it is that the conspirators felt that shift, that change in the air, that almost imperceptible alteration in the way the guards moved, or the way certain eyes tracked certain men across the training yard, and they understood that the time they had imagined they still had was in fact already running out, which had been careful and gradual and oriented towards some unspecified future moment of readiness, became instead the planning of people who understood that imperfect action at the right moment is worth more than perfect preparation at the wrong one. The conversations grew shorter and more concentrated. The decisions that had been deferred were now made. The men who needed to know the specific hour and the specific signal were told, and through all of it, the lamp flames in the corridors of the Ludus continued their patient work, guttering and recovering, indifferent to what moved in the spaces between them, carrying their small warmth forward into a darkness that pressed in from all directions and was not quite extinguished. There is a particular quality of hope that belongs specifically to people who have very little reason to hope and who hope anyway. Not the bright, easy hope of those who have been given cause for optimism, but the slower, heavier, more durable hope of those for whom hope is an act of will rather than a response to evidence. This is what moved through the gladiatorial school of Batiatus in those final nights before the break, what passed between men and the coded pressures of hands and the held steadiness of eyes, a hope that was not innocent, that had been tested and worn and still remained, that had looked at the full weight of what they were attempting and had not turned away from it. The stone walls cooled and contracted around them, making their small, quiet sounds. The lamps in the corridor breathed their slow amber breath. Somewhere in the city of Capua, well-fed men slept in rooms that no one had locked from the outside, in beds that were not mats on stone floors, under no obligation to perform or to bleed for anyone else's entertainment when morning came. And in the school, in the pressed and watchful dark of those final nights, something that had begun as a whisper had become a certainty. Not the certainty of outcome, which no honest person could offer, but the certainty of intention. They were going to try. What came next would require the courage of men who had already given a great deal, and still found, when they reached inside themselves, that there was something more. But that is a story for when you have rested a little. The doors, the running, the long first breath of open air. For now, let the lamp hold its flame in the dark, and let the night be what it is, and let sleep come. The morning had not yet decided to become morning. That long held breath hour when the darkness is still complete, but something beneath it has already shifted. The way stone shifts before it cracks, slowly, without sound, without any outward sign at all. The air inside the Ludus at Capua was thick with the particular stillness of men pretending to sleep. Men lying on their narrow pallets with their eyes closed and their minds moving like water, finding the lowest path, tracing and retracing the shape of what was about to happen, testing it the way a tongue tests a loose tooth, gently, repeatedly, unable to leave it alone. The kitchen had been the turning point. It is said, and the story has been told so many times in so many forms that its edges have worn smooth as river pebbles, that it was the kitchen of the Ludus where the first true moment of rupture occurred, where the plan that had lived in whispers for weeks finally touched the physical world and became irreversible. The gladiators who would lead the escape had gathered what weapons they could find there, not the fine iron tools of the arena that were counted and locked away each evening under careful eyes, but the humble, unglamorous implements of a working kitchen, cleavers and spits, knives used for jointing meat, heavy iron ladles worn dark with use. These were not the weapons a warrior would choose. These were the weapons of the hour that was given to them, and they took them with steady hands. There were somewhere in the region of 70 or 80 men in that first group, though the sources that have come down to us through the centuries are not always in precise agreement on the number, and in the darkness and confusion of those first moments, no one was counting. What mattered was the movement, the sudden, concerted, quiet as possible surge through corridors that they had walked so many times before in submission, now walked differently, walked with intention, walked as men reclaiming the geometry of their own bodies. The guards posted within the school were not expecting this. They were expecting the night to be what every other night had been, long, uneventful, smelling of sweat and straw, and the faint copper trace that never quite left a place where men bled regularly for the entertainment of others. They were not expecting the kitchen slaves to become something else entirely in the space of a breath. The violence of those first minutes was swift and close and necessary, and it is not the part of this story that lingers most meaningfully in the imagination. What lingers is what came after, the gates and the opening of them, and the air on the other side, because there is a quality to air that has been forbidden to you, that is unlike any other air you have ever breathed. Or perhaps it is that you suddenly have a different weight within it, something loosened, something expanded. Spartacus stepped through the gates of Bruttius's Ludus into the Campanian night, and the sky above Capua was enormous and salted with stars, and the world was wide again in a way it had not been for what must have felt like a lifetime, measured not in months, but in constrictions, in walls, in the narrowing logic of a life designed to end in sand. They moved through the outskirts of the city without ceremony, without torchlight they did not need to carry, because the stars were sufficient, and because drawing attention was the one thing they could not afford. The roads of Campania at that hour were empty. The traders and travelers who filled them by day had long since found their inns and their fires, and the 70-odd men who passed along the dark margin of the road were shadows among shadows, moving south and then east, following the pull of something that was not yet a plan so much as an instinct, an animal comprehension that to survive they needed high ground, difficult ground, ground that Rome would find inconvenient, and so they moved toward Vesuvius. The mountain announces itself slowly at first, the way all large things do, as a shape against the sky that seems at first to be simply the horizon, until the horizon begins to have more presence than a horizon ought to, until it resolves itself into something deliberate, something that rises rather than merely extends. In the darkness, Vesuvius was a great softness, blotting out a portion of the stars, its upper slopes lost in a faint haziness that the night produced from its own breath. The air around its lower foothills already carried something different from the plains, cooler, threaded with the smell of green things, of soil that had been enriched by centuries of volcanic exhalation into extraordinary fertility. The slopes of Vesuvius were, in those years, covered in dense vegetation, vines and wild growth tumbling over the ancient stone in exuberant profusion, because the mountain had not erupted within living memory, within several generations of living memory, and so the land around it had been allowed to become extravagant and tangled and deep. As the group of escaped gladiators climbed higher onto those slopes in the last hours of darkness, the vegetation closed around them like an embrace, which it was of a kind, the mountain receiving them into its confusion of leaves and shadow, offering concealment that the flat plains of Campania could never have provided. The path, such as it was not a Roman road. It was not engineered or maintained or measured. It was the kind of path made by animals following the same routes season after season, and it wound between stands of old trees and outcroppings of dark volcanic rock in ways that required attention and the use of hands as well as feet. Men who had spent months in a gladiatorial school, who had been reduced in so many ways, and yet had been simultaneously hardened into something extraordinary in terms of sheer physical capability, climbed without complaint. Their lungs worked, their legs worked, they were alive in their bodies in the clean, uncomplicated way that only becomes fully apparent when the body is finally allowed to do what bodies are designed to do, move freely through open space. It is said that they found a defensible position on the higher slopes before the sun had fully risen, settling into a natural bowl of terrain screened by the dense growth that covered the mountain's flanks on every side. From here they could see a very great deal without being easily seen themselves, the broad plain of Campania spreading out below them in the gray-pink light of early morning, the roads beginning to show their pale ribbons as the sun found them, the distant smudge of Capua itself, already surely beginning to understand what had happened in the night, already surely sending word to whatever authority would respond. But between that authority and the men on the mountain, there was the mountain itself, all its tangle and its steepness, and for this morning at least, for this one soft and exhausted and exhilarated morning, the mountain was enough. They rested in shifts, because old habits of vigilance do not dissolve overnight. Some slept, genuinely and deeply, with the kind of abandon that is only possible when the body has finally decided it is safe enough, when the mind relinquishes its grip on the next moment for a little while. Others sat and watched the plain, or talked quietly among themselves in the mixture of languages that this group carried, Thracian, Gallic, German, a rough common Latin that served as the lingua franca of the arena, and now served as the language of this new and nameless thing they were becoming. Spartacus, the story goes, moved among them without ceremony, sitting for a while here and there, speaking when he spoke briefly, and with the particular quality of attention that leaders who earn, rather than claim their authority, tend to have, the quality of actually listening, of allowing the person before them to feel genuinely received. The sun climbed the sky, and the mountain held them, and somewhere on those dense volcanic slopes, in the smell of wild herbs crushed underfoot, and the distant sound of water finding its way down through the rock, something that had only ever existed in the dark language of whispers began to take on the weight of the actual. They were out. They were together. They were on ground that was theirs, at least for now, in the way that ground belongs to whoever stands upon it with the will to remain. The fire they allowed themselves that evening was small and carefully placed, sheltered by rock and the curve of the hillside, its light contained so that it would not carry down to the plain below. But it was a fire they had chosen to light, at a time and place of their choosing, and that distinction was everything. Its warmth moved among them like something remembered from before, from a long time before, from the lives they had lived when they were still the authors of their own hours. The smoke rose and thinned and disappeared into the darkening sky, and the mountains settled around them, vast and patient and strangely generous, as the night gathered itself in, and the first true sleep of freedom began to find them, one by one, in the rustling, breathing dark. And soon enough, that small encampment on the slopes would begin to grow. The mountain breathes at night. You can feel it if you press your palm flat against the dark earth of its upper slopes. The faint warmth that rises from somewhere far below, from depths that no Roman surveyor had ever mapped and no Thracian elder had ever named. A gentle subterranean exhale that reminds you, quietly and without drama, that the ground beneath you is not entirely asleep. The volcanic soil of Vesuvius holds heat, the way old stone walls hold the memory of a summer afternoon, slowly, generously, long after the sun has moved on, and the sky above has gone the deep, soft blue of a world settling into rest. And it was on this mountain, in the weeks and months following the escape from Capua, that something entirely new began to form itself out of hunger and firelight, and the peculiar trembling relief of people who had not expected to live this long. The slopes of Vesuvius were, in those years, thickly dressed in growth. The ancient eruptions that had built the mountain had also, over long centuries, left behind a soil so dark and so richly mineraled that vines had spread across the lower terraces in heavy abundance, their roots gripping the hillside with a patience that seemed almost deliberate. And above the vineyards, the forest thickened into something older and quieter. Oak and ilex and a dense, aromatic scrub of wild laurel, rosemary running loose along the rocky outcroppings, the smell of it sharp and clean on cool mornings when the mist had not yet lifted from the valleys below. It was said that local herdsmen had known secret paths through this upper forest for generations, tracks that were invisible from the roads below, trails that wound through the undergrowth as softly as a rumor, and arrived eventually at the broad, flat crater at the summit, a wide and grassy caldera that had long since forgotten its own violence and had become instead something almost peaceful, a bowl of wind and sky open to the heavens, from which you could look south toward the Tyrrhenian Sea and see it lying flat and silver in the distance, and look north and trace the long, pale ribbon of the road toward Capua, and know exactly where you were in the world and how far you had come. The escaped gladiators and the people who had begun to join them made their camp on the upper slopes, within the shelter of the tree line, where the forest gave cover from any eyes below, and the warmth of the earth itself softened the nights. They built their fires with care, not the careless leaping bonfires of celebration, but smaller, considered fires, laid close to the ground, banked with the dry wood of fallen branches, so that they burned long and low and steady, giving off more heat than light, their smoke thinning quickly in the mountain air before it could carry a signal to anyone watching from the plains. In the evenings, people gathered in the way that people have always gathered around warmth, drawing close without quite meaning to, shoulders almost touching, faces turned toward the light, the body's ancient knowledge that fire means safety, fire means that the night is held at arm's length, fire means that you are not alone, and they were not alone. That was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about those early weeks on the mountain. They had gone up the slopes a band of perhaps 70 or 80 people, moving fast and moving frightened, armed with the kitchen implements they had seized from the Ludus, and such gladiatorial weapons as they had managed to carry. But the mountain seemed to draw others to it. Word moves through the slave population of any region the way water moves through limestone. Invisibly, finding every crack and fissure, emerging sometimes in places that surprise you, and in the countryside around Vesuvius, there were people everywhere who had been waiting, without knowing exactly what they were waiting for, to hear that something had changed. Slaves from the great agricultural estates of Campania came first, slipping away from their barracks in the hours before dawn, moving through the vineyards they had spent their lives tending, and arriving at the tree line of the mountain breathless and uncertain, and then, finding themselves welcomed, sitting down by the low fires, with the particular stillness of people who have just put down something very heavy that they have been carrying for a very long time. There were shepherds too, it is said. Free men technically, but free in name more than in comfort. Men who had been working other men's hillsides for generations, and who owned almost nothing, and owed almost everything, and they came up the mountain with their knowledge of the paths, and their understanding of which streams ran clean, and which valleys stayed warm through the night. And this knowledge was worth more than a sword, more than armor, because an army that does not know its own ground is already half lost. And there were others harder to categorize, people from the edges of things, people who had been living in the margins of the Roman world and finding those margins narrower every year. And they came to Vesuvius because the mountain had become, in the space of a few weeks, a kind of rumor made solid, a place you could walk to if you dared. The days on the mountain had their own rhythm, slower than the days in the Ludus, but not empty. In the mornings, the mist lay across the lower slopes, and the air tasted of damp earth and laurel. And in that cool, gray-green early light, the men who had been gladiators moved through forms and exercises that had become second nature, the repetition of movement that training had written into their muscles, the same drills that had once been performed under the eyes of guards, now performed freely, by choice, for a purpose that was their own. Others watched and learned. The skills that had been beaten into men to make them entertaining in the arena were now given away freely, passed from hand to hand, like something that had always wanted to be shared. At midday, when the sun fell straight and warm on the upper slopes, and the smell of the volcanic earth intensified into something almost spiced, almost sweet, the mountain felt almost hospitable, a great quiet host, ancient beyond any human reckoning, holding them on its wide shoulders without effort or complaint. People ate simply from what they had carried, from what the mountain's forests offered. Mushrooms and wild herbs, small game, the berries that grew in thick clusters along the rocky paths. They ate together. That detail matters more than it might seem. In the world they had all come from, eating together as equals was not something that happened to slaves, not something that happened without hierarchy and permission and the careful observance of someone else's rules. On the mountain, there were no tables of masters and tables of servants. There was fire and food and the shared fact of hunger met. In the evenings, as the light softened and the shadow of the mountain stretched itself long and blue across the Campanian plain below, the fires were laid again, one after another across the slope, small lights scattered in the dusk, like something scattered in the dusk, like something a careful hand had set out deliberately, a constellation brought down to earth. The sound of the encampment in those evening hours was a gentle sound, the low murmur of many languages finding ways to be understood. Thracian and Gallic and Greek, and the rough working Latin that had become the language of the enslaved throughout all of Italy. Fragments of song now and then, a laugh in the dark, the occasional cry of a child, because there were families here too among those who had come, women who had fled with their children from the estates, and who now sat by the fires nursing infants or laying sleeping forms gently on cloaks spread across the warm ground. Above it all, the mountain stood unchanged, older than Rome, older than any name that had been given to it, its summit open to the stars that turned slowly through the clear Italian night in their ancient unhurried arcs. The soil breathed its patient warmth upward through the dark, through the spread cloaks and the sleeping bodies, through the roots of the laurel and the oak, and the fires burned down to their orange cores, and then to the soft gray of cooling ash, and the people on the mountain slept, and the night was quiet. It would not always be so quiet. Soon enough the plains below would need to be reckoned with, and the question of what to do with freedom, of where to take it and how to defend it, would press itself gently into all their waking hours. But that reckoning belonged to the days ahead, to the long, extraordinary story still unfolding. For now, the mountain held them, and the fires held the dark, and the warm earth rose to meet the weight of all those sleeping, breathing, finally resting bodies, and the night asked nothing of anyone at all. The slopes of Vesuvius were quieter now in the early mornings, or perhaps it only seemed that way because the encampment had grown so large that individual sounds blurred together into a kind of low, breathing hum, the hum of people waking, of fires being coaxed back to life from their overnight embers, of water being carried in clay vessels and wooden pails up from the streams that threaded through the lower woodland. Where once there had been a few dozen men crouching beneath the shadow of the mountain, there were now hundreds, and then more hundreds still, arriving in ones and twos, and sometimes in loose, uncertain groups, their feet dusty from roads walked by night, their eyes carrying that particular mixture of exhaustion and astonishment that belongs to a person who has just done something they were not entirely certain they would survive. They came from everywhere, and they came from almost nothing. Slaves who had slipped away from farms and vineyards in the deep hours before dawn, leaving behind the locked storerooms and the overseer's quarters in the quiet, patient terror of a life owned by another person. Shepherds who had spent years moving flocks across the high pastures of Campania and Lucania, men who knew every fold of the land, every seasonal track, every hollow where a fire would not be seen from the road. Former prisoners of war who had been worked in the fields and quarries of southern Italy for so long that they had nearly forgotten the languages of their homelands, and who now, hearing those languages spoken again around the fires on the mountain, found those words returning to them like water rising slowly through dry soil. There were Gauls and Germans, Thracians and Syrians, men from the eastern coastal cities and men from the deep interior of lands Rome had swallowed whole. There were even, it is said, a small number of impoverished free men, dispossessed farmers who had lost their land to the great slave-worked estates that had been spreading across the Italian countryside for generations, men who had nothing left to protect and everything, still, to hope for. What Spartacus understood, and this may be the most remarkable thing about him, the thing that separates his story from a simple account of desperate flight, was that hope alone would not keep these people alive. Feeling was not enough. Fury was not enough. What they needed, with a kind of absolute and practical urgency, was organization. They needed to eat, which meant they needed to know who could forage and who could hunt, and how far the foraging parties could safely range before they risked being seen by a Roman patrol. They needed weapons, which meant they needed to know which of the men arriving on the mountain had experience working metal, and which had hands calloused by the use of agricultural tools that could, with a little rethinking, become instruments of something other than farming. They needed to know who among them had fought before, in what kind of terrain, under what kind of discipline, and who had never held anything more threatening than a pruning hook. And so, across the weeks that gathered themselves into months, something began to take shape on those slopes that was neither the ragged mob that Rome would have preferred it to be, nor the polished legionary force that Rome most feared, but something in between, something genuinely new, shaped by the particular mixture of people and knowledge and necessity that had gathered itself under the smoke of Vesuvius. The gladiators who had escaped from the Ludus at Capua formed, in these early weeks, a kind of corps. They were few in number, but enormously experienced in the reality of violence. Not the abstract theory of it, not the distant command of it from a hillside, but the immediate breathing muscular reality of one body against another, of ground and balance and timing. Spartacus and Crixus and the others who had trained in that stone-walled school had learned to read a fight the way a river pilot reads water, and now they began, in their different ways, to teach. The mornings were given over to training, and the sound of it drifted through the mountain air along with the wood smoke. The rhythmic impact of wooden practice weapons against shields fashioned from wicker and bound leather, the sharp corrections called out in half a dozen languages, the particular grunt and shuffle of men learning to move together rather than separately. It is said that Spartacus paid close attention to the Roman methods of fighting, not with admiration exactly, but with the focused pragmatism of someone who understands that the enemy's strength is worth understanding. He had seen those methods from the inside, having served alongside Roman forces in Thrace before his capture, and he knew that what made a Roman legion formidable was not primarily the individual skill of its soldiers, but the discipline of its units, the way men moved and held and retreated and reformed as a single coordinated body, rather than as a collection of individual combatants, each making their own separate decisions. He began to instill something of this understanding in the men training on the slopes, though always adapted, always reshaped to suit the people he was working with, many of whom came from fighting traditions that valued individual boldness and personal combat in ways that were not simply wrong, but were in the right ground in the right moment, genuinely effective. The weapons problem was solved with considerable ingenuity. Iron was scarce but not impossible to find. Raiding parties, small, fast, carefully planned, began moving through the countryside below the mountain, targeting the farmsteads and estates of the wealthy, with a selectivity that the story suggests was deliberate. Tools were collected. Wagon wheels provided iron for smithing. The story goes that captured farm equipment was melted and reworked into blades and spear points in makeshift forges built among the rocks, the fires burning low and hot through the cool nights, while the smiths worked and the sparks drifted upward and were lost among the stars. Shields were made from the hides of animals. Handles were carved from the abundant timber of the mountain's wooded slopes. It was slow work, imperfect work, the weapons uneven and sometimes rough, but they were weapons, and they multiplied week by week as more hands joined the effort. The question of food was equally pressing and equally resolved through a combination of careful planning and the particular knowledge that the shepherds and farm workers brought with them. These were people who understood the land of southern Italy in a way that its wealthy Roman owners did not. They knew which crops were stored where, which roads were watched and which were not, which seasons brought which abundance, how long a large group of people could subsist on what a particular valley had to offer before it was necessary to move. This knowledge was quietly invaluable. It kept the encampment fed through the difficult early weeks when Roman forces were beginning to take notice of what had gathered on the mountain, and it would continue to shape the movement of the rebel army long after it had descended from Vesuvius into the wider landscape of Italy. What grew over these months of training and foraging and planning and argument, and the slow building of trust among people who had been strangers, was something that deserved to be called an army in the fullest sense, not merely a large number of people with weapons, but a force with structure, with practiced coordination, with leaders who had earned their authority through demonstrated capability rather than through birth or ownership. Crixus led his contingent of Gauls with fierce personal loyalty, flowing in both directions, between himself and the men who followed him. Oenomaus, it is said, was known for a kind of steady, unhurried authority that made people around him feel that panic was simply not available as an option. And Spartacus himself moved through the encampment with something that those who described him long after seemed to struggle to fully name. A quality of attention, perhaps, a way of seeing each person he spoke to as a specific individual with specific capacities, rather than as an undifferentiated mass of the desperate. He remembered names. He remembered where people had come from. He asked about particular skills and particular fears with equal seriousness. By the time the last of the autumn warmth was fading from the air above the mountain, and the fires in the encampment were being built higher to keep back the chill that came rolling down from the higher slopes each evening, the force that had gathered there numbered in the thousands. The wood smoke rose into the cooling sky and drifted south on the evening wind, and in the glow of those fires, men who had once owned nothing, not even their own labor, were learning to move together with a discipline and a purposefulness that would, in the weeks ahead, carry them down from the mountain and out into the wide, contested landscape of southern Italy, where the first real test of everything they had built together was quietly waiting to begin. The fires are still burning on the slopes behind you as this part of the story continues. The mountains slowly receding into memory as the road opens ahead, winding down through the soft southern Italian countryside where the grasses grow long beside the ditches, and the olive trees stand in their silver-gray rows like patient witnesses to everything that passes beneath them. It is morning, or something very like it, the sky still holding that particular pale quality of early light that has not yet committed itself to the full warmth of day, and the air carries the smell of turned earth and wild fennel and the distant suggestion of wood smoke drifting from somewhere beyond the next ridge. This is the landscape that Spartacus and the men and women who followed him now move through. No longer a band of desperate escapees sheltering on volcanic rock, but something that had grown quietly and steadily into something Rome had not yet found a proper word for. The army, if we may call it that now, moved with a confidence that had been earned rather than assumed. Through the weeks and months of living on Vesuvius, of drilling with improvised weapons and learning the rhythms of the group, of watching Spartacus and Crixus and Oenomaus turn chaos into something resembling order, these people had become soldiers in all the ways that mattered. They did not yet have the gleaming equipment of a Roman legion, the polished greaves and the precisely identical shields, but they had something that equipment alone cannot purchase, which is the knowledge, deep in the body and the bones, that they had already survived things they were not supposed to survive, and that survival had made them formidable. The first significant test came when Rome sent a force to deal with what the Senate and the commanders of the day likely still imagined to be a manageable problem, a slave uprising, messy and embarrassing certainly, but the sort of thing that Roman order had always been able to compress back into submission with sufficient application of force. The commander sent, it is recorded, was a praetor, a man of rank and some experience, and the soldiers he brought numbered in the thousands, a serious force by any ordinary measure. They approached the encampment on Vesuvius with the methodical confidence of men who understood their business, and for a time, it is said, they settled in at the base of the mountain, intending simply to wait the rebels out, to let hunger and discomfort do what swords had not yet been called upon to do. But Spartacus had been watching and thinking, and what he understood, in a way that perhaps the Roman commander underestimated, was that the mountain itself was a tool. The story goes that the rebels fashioned ropes from the wild vines that grew thickly across the upper slopes, long plaited ropes that could bear the weight of a man, and with these they lowered themselves down a hidden face of the mountain, a drop so steep and so unlikely that the Romans had left it unguarded entirely, confident that no rational force would attempt such a descent. And so the rebels came around the back of their own besiegers, moving through the dark and the smoke-tinged air, and when the Roman camp woke, it woke to the sound of its own defenses being taken from the wrong direction, and the Praetorian force, caught entirely off its expectations, scattered and fled, leaving behind weapons and provisions, and perhaps most valuably, the deep psychological understanding that Spartacus would not be contained by conventional assumptions. This is how it went in those first remarkable months of open campaigning across the soft inland country of southern Italy. The rebels moved quickly, far more quickly than a Roman force of similar size could manage, in part because they carried less, in part because they had no supply trains to protect, living instead off the land and off the stores of the estates and farms they passed through, and in part because Spartacus seemed to possess an instinctive reading of terrain that turned every hillside and every river valley into an advantage waiting to be understood. Ancient writers would later observe, with a mixture of admiration and something close to discomfort, that his tactics showed a sophistication and a structural understanding of Roman military method that they found surprising in a man of his origins, though we might quietly note that this surprise says rather more about the assumptions of those writers than it does about Spartacus himself, for the Thracian tribes had been fighting the armies of great powers for generations, and a man raised in that tradition would have absorbed a great deal about how organized forces think and move. A second Praetorian force came, and then another, each one dispatched with growing urgency as the reports filtering back to Rome grew more troubling. It is said that one commander, a man named Publius Verinius, brought a substantial force south and attempted to engage the rebel army in the open country, and that what he found was not the disorganized mob he may have imagined, but something far more disciplined, capable of forming up, of holding a line, of using the contours of the land to funnel and channel an enemy into positions of disadvantage. The engagement did not go well for Rome. Verinius lost soldiers and equipment, and the story goes that he came close to losing his own command insignia, which would have been an extraordinary humiliation, the physical symbols of Roman authority taken by men who had been property not so many months before. Through all of this, the rebel force continued to grow. Word moved through the countryside faster than any official messenger, passed in whispers from estate to estate, carried by the shepherds who moved between the high summer pastures and the winter lowlands, murmured between slaves working the same soil, who had never before had any particular reason to imagine that their situation might be otherwise. People came to join the army in ones and twos, and sometimes in larger groups, slipping away from the farms and the households and the mines, drawn by something that was partly desperation and partly the extraordinary and almost unimaginable fact that the thing Spartacus represented was actually working. This was not a rumor of resistance somewhere distant. This was a living army moving through the very landscape they could see from the hills where they worked, and it was winning. There is something deeply human about what must have happened in those camps in the evenings, when the marching was done and the fires were laid, and the smell of wood smoke rose into the cooling southern Italian sky. People who had come from every corner of the known world, Gauls and Greeks and Syrians and Thracians, and people born on Italian soil whose parents had been brought in chains from places they had never seen, all of them finding themselves in the same rough shelters, eating from the same pots, falling asleep to the same soft crackling of fire and the same distant sound of insects in the grass. There would have been languages that could not understand one another, customs that rubbed against each other, histories of mutual suspicion, and old enmity that did not dissolve simply because they were now on the same side of a Roman sword. And yet they were there, and they were together, and something was holding, at least for now. Spartacus, in the accounts that survive, is described in these months as a man of striking self-possession, someone who led by the quality of his presence rather than by loudness or force, who distributed the spoils of captured estates with an insistence on fairness that the ancient sources note with apparent surprise, as though equitable treatment of followers were itself a novelty worth recording. He prohibited the use of gold and silver among the rebel forces, it is said, insisting that the wealth captured go to practical supplies rather than personal accumulation, a policy that speaks to someone thinking not in terms of personal gain, but in terms of building something that could last, something that could sustain itself across seasons, rather than simply burning bright and brief. The towns of southern Italy watched from behind their walls as this extraordinary thing moved through their landscape. Some supplied provisions, willingly or otherwise, some simply waited. The great estates sat quiet and anxious, the owners gone to safer places or locked inside with whatever guards they could muster. The roads, those remarkable Roman roads that held the whole peninsula together like stitching in cloth, were now being walked by people who had been made by Roman law into instruments rather than persons, and they were walking them freely, and the fires they lit at night sent their thin columns of smoke up into a sky that belonged, for this brief and improbable season, to no one in particular. It could not last forever, this run of victories, this almost dreamlike sequence of praetorian forces met and turned and scattered back toward Rome in disarray. Nothing so unlikely sustains itself without the world eventually reasserting its weight. But in those months, in that soft southern autumn and into the colder season that followed, something genuinely extraordinary had happened, and the people who had made it happen knew it, in their bodies and their exhausted bones, as they lay down in the dark, near the warmth of their fires, and let sleep come, slowly and gently, over the hills. The road ahead is still long, and it winds northward now, toward the mountains, and toward a question that the whole rebel army will have to answer together about what this freedom is actually for, and where it is meant to go. But that is a question for another night, and for now, the fires burn low, and the southern Italian dark is very soft and very still. There is a particular quality to the light in southern Italy as summer begins to loosen its grip. When the air carries the first faint suggestion of something cooler coming down from the high places of the world, and the fires in an encampment at evening burn a little longer before the men feel ready to sleep. It was into this shifting season that the great army of Spartacus turned its face northward, away from the familiar hills and valleys where so many small victories had been won, and began the long, extraordinary march toward the Alps and whatever lay beyond them. By this point, the rebellion had grown into something that no one in Rome had imagined possible, something that the Senate itself struggled to name with any confidence, because to give it the wrong name was to misunderstand it, and to misunderstand it was to underestimate it again, as Roman commanders had done so many times already across the fields of the south. The army that moved north was not a rabble, not a desperate scattering of frightened people, clutching whatever weapons came to hand. It was a force of many tens of thousands, the estimates varying in the ancient sources, some placing the number at 70,000 souls, others higher, others lower, but all agreeing that it was vast and that it moved with a discipline and an order that continued to astonish those who encountered it. The campfires of such an army, spread across the evening landscape, would have been visible from great distances, a constellation brought down to earth, wavering and warm, spreading across the low ground between the hills wherever there was water and shelter, and open space enough for the multitude that had gathered under Spartacus. And at the center of all that movement, at the heart of all that organized, purposeful striding northward, was a question that history has never entirely answered, a question that scholars and dreamers alike have turned over quietly in the long centuries since. What did Spartacus intend? The most natural reading of the northward march is the simplest one, and simplicity has a kind of gravity that pulls the mind toward it in the drowsy hours. If you have been a slave in Italy, if you were taken from a land beyond the mountains, if the world you remember and perhaps still dream of lies somewhere to the north and east of the Alps, then the direction of freedom is obvious. You walk toward the mountains. You cross them if you can. You find your way home, or you find a place where Rome's long arm does not yet reach, and you lay down your weapons and begin again. This is what the ancient sources largely suggest was Spartacus's intention, and it has the ring of something deeply human about it, the wish simply to leave, to carry your people out of a place of suffering and into open air. The army moved through Samnium, through the rougher interior country, where the roads were less certain, and the land rose and fell in long undulating rhythms, the hills covered in thin grasses and scattered oak, the rivers running quick and cold from their mountain sources. The fires at night were built from whatever timber could be gathered, and they burned in that particular way of large communal fires, throwing light up into the faces of those gathered around them, casting long shifting shadows behind, and filling the air with the smell of wood smoke that drifted out across the darkened landscape and slowly dissolved into the stars. Around those fires, the conversations would have ranged across everything. Language mixing freely among people who had come from a dozen different corners of the known world, and the night would have seemed both endless and strangely peaceful, the way nights do when you are moving toward something. But the peace within that movement was not complete. There were, the story goes, disagreements, real and sometimes bitter divisions within the leadership of the rebellion, and these divisions would deepen and eventually fracture the great enterprise in ways that no Roman army had yet managed to do. Crixus the Gaul, whose name we have already heard spoken in these quiet narrations, had from early on represented a different temperament within the rebellion, a willingness, even an eagerness to remain in Italy, to keep fighting, to take the war directly to Rome rather than retreating from it. Whether this difference was purely strategic, or whether it carried within it something older, some cultural or tribal loyalty that made the particular geography of home feel differently to a Gaul than to a Thracian, is not something the sources make plain, but it was real and it mattered, and as the army pressed northward, it carried this tension within it the way a river carries silt, invisible beneath the surface, but present in everything. We should rest with the landscape for a moment, because the landscape itself is part of the story in a way that is easy to lose in the telling of battles and decisions and historical forces. The Apennines run like a spine down the length of the Italian peninsula, and to march north through them is to move through a world of changing light and changing air, through valleys where the morning mist sits heavy until the sun climbs high enough to burn it away, through passes where the wind comes through with a cold authority that reminds you that the high places of the world do not care particularly about the ambitions of those who move beneath them. The army of Spartacus would have felt all of this, the way the ground changed underfoot, the way the vegetation shifted, the way the sound of the wind changed pitch as the land rose around them. And perhaps some of them, those who had been brought the farthest and kept the longest, would have felt something in that cooler air, some faint answering recognition, the body remembering the climate it had known before. By the time the army reached the region of the Po Valley, the great flat agricultural plain that stretches across northern Italy, they had covered an enormous distance, and the Alps themselves, it is said, were visible in the far north on clear days, a line of white along the horizon that was not cloud, but something more permanent and more astonishing. To have walked from the slopes of Vesuvius to the place where you could see the Alps with your own eyes was already a kind of miracle, and the men and women who stood in that flat country and looked north must have felt the nearness of something almost beyond imagining. And yet here, in the north, at the very threshold of the mountains and whatever freedom lay beyond them, the army did not cross. The sources are not entirely clear on what happened, on whether there was a battle first, on whether the Gauls and the Germans in the force pushed for remaining, on whether the people themselves were reluctant to leave the peninsula that had in its terrible way become the only home most of them had known. It is said that a Gallic tribe, the Allobroges, turned the vanguard of the force back, though the exact nature of that encounter, and how much weight to give it in the larger story of what happened next, remains something historians have debated quietly across long centuries. What we can say is that the march north stands as one of the great mysterious passages in the whole long story, a moment where the intention behind the movement remains just beyond our reach, where we can see the shape of it, but not quite see through it to the heart of the man who led it. Perhaps Spartacus wished to cross. Perhaps something prevented him. Perhaps the people he led had made a different choice, and he, understanding that the rebellion was never his alone to command, honored that choice, even as it turned the army back toward the south. The fires burned wherever they made camp in that broad northern plain, as they had burned all along the long road from Capua, from Vesuvius, from the victories and the seasons of survival in the south. They burned with the same patient warmth, offering the same circle of light in the surrounding dark, and the people gathered around them were, for a little longer, together, which is perhaps the simplest thing that can be said about any of this. And in that togetherness, in the slow evening settling of so many people around so many small fires, the great question of what came next was already forming itself quietly, the way questions do in the last hours before sleep, not demanding an answer yet, simply making itself known, resting there in the warm air just beyond the reach of the firelight, waiting for morning. The mountains had been so close. For weeks, perhaps longer, the peaks of the Alps had existed somewhere ahead of the great column of marching people, like a promise made in the language of wind and stone, a promise that said, beyond us, freedom, beyond us, the wide world where Rome's reach grows thin, and finally disappears into grass and distance, and other people's skies. Spartacus had looked north, and the story goes that he had believed in that direction with something deeper than strategy, something closer to the quiet, unshakable conviction of a man who has seen his homeland's hills and carried them inside him through every dark year since. The north meant the passes meant Gaul, or Thrace, or simply elsewhere, and elsewhere was the only destination that mattered, when the place you had been kept was a cage made of an entire civilization. And yet the column turned. It is difficult, lying here in the soft dark, to fully hold what that turning meant, not as a military decision recorded in the shorthand of Roman historians, who were never much interested in what the rebels themselves were thinking, but as a human moment, a moment in which the direction of tens of thousands of lives pivoted like a compass needle disturbed by something unseen. We do not have Spartacus's own words. We do not have his counsels written down, his private reasoning preserved in any letter or journal, because men in his position did not write letters that survived, did not keep journals that any Roman scholar would have thought worth copying. What we have instead are the traces left by that turning, the shape of what happened afterward, and the quiet, careful work of imagining backward from consequence to cause. The ancient sources, and here we must hold them gently, the way you hold a lamp whose flame is very small and might gutter. Those sources suggest that the Gallic and Germanic warriors within the rebel army, the men who followed Crixus and Oenomaus, were unwilling to go further north. It is said that they wanted to remain in Italy, to continue the campaign that was already proving, beyond any reasonable expectation, that Roman legions could be met and beaten in the open field. Why retreat toward distant mountains, when the land they stood on had already given them so much? Why march away from the warmth of the south, away from the fertile plain and the memory of every victory, toward cold passes that offered nothing but departure? For men who had been torn from their lives by Rome's appetite and deposited into servitude in Roman soil, Italy itself was the wound, and there was perhaps something in them that needed to answer the wound rather than simply leave it behind. Spartacus's own intention remains, even now, one of history's most gently kept secrets. Some scholars have believed he always meant to lead his people out of Italy entirely, to dissolve the army into its various national groups and scatter everyone homeward, Thracians toward Thrace, Gauls toward Gaul, the unaffiliated toward whatever horizon felt like theirs. This reading makes a particular kind of sense when you consider how he had moved, always pushing north when he could, always maintaining a momentum that felt directional rather than merely tactical. A man conducting an indefinite Italian campaign does not march his people in sustained arcs toward the one set of passes that lead outside the peninsula. Direction is intention made visible, and his direction had been, for months, unmistakably northward. Others have suggested, more softly, that he may never have had a single coherent goal beyond the immediate survival and freedom of the people who followed him, that the march north was a military calculation, a way of drawing Rome's forces out of favorable terrain, and that the turning back was simply the next calculation, made in response to what the army needed, rather than what the general may have privately longed for. This reading is harder to dismiss than it might seem, because Spartacus had shown himself to be, above almost everything else, a man who understood the difference between what he wanted and what the situation allowed. He had moved with the grain of circumstance throughout the rebellion, bending where rigidity would have broken everything. What the story tells us most clearly, if we listen to it in the way you listen to something in the dark, not looking directly at it, but letting it come to the edges of awareness, is that the rebel army was never a single thing. It had always been a gathering, a confluence of people whose common experience was slavery and whose common desire was its end, but whose ideas about what came after that end were as various as their origins, their ages, their languages, their losses. Freedom is not one place on a map. It is not one direction. And when tens of thousands of people are each carrying their own interior compass toward their own understanding of what it means to no longer be property, those compasses will not always agree. The fire burned at the center of all of it, the literal fires of the encampments that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and the particular warmth of many bodies gathered against the Italian night, and the figurative fire, the one that had started in a gladiatorial kitchen in Capua, and somehow spread until it was visible from Rome itself. That fire needed tending, and tending meant listening to the people gathered around it, even when their voices pulled in different directions, even when the consensus they reached was not the one you might have chosen if the choice had been yours alone. It is said, or at least it is suggested in the texture of what followed, that Spartacus accepted the turning. Not happily, perhaps, not without his own private reckoning with what was being given up, but he accepted it in the way that a leader who genuinely serves his people, rather than merely commanding them, must sometimes accept the collective will over his own. This is not a small thing. This is, in its way, a remarkable thing, because the temptation for a man of his demonstrated ability must have been considerable. The temptation to override, to insist, to use the authority his victories had built in order to push the column northward regardless. He did not do this, as far as we can tell. Or if he tried, he failed, and in failing, still managed to hold the army together rather than fracture it entirely into rival factions. And so, the long column, the city of the dispossessed, moving through the Italian countryside, with all its wagons and livestock and children and accumulated supplies, turned its face south again. The passes of the Alps receded behind them, growing smaller in memory and in hope, still there in the distance, still visible on clear days if you knew how to look, but no longer the destination. The south opened ahead instead, the familiar south, the south they already knew, the olive groves and river valleys and the long roads between towns that had already seen this army pass once in the other direction. There is a particular quality to a road you walk twice. The second time, every landmark carries the memory of the first, and you are somehow both in the present moment and in your own recent past simultaneously. The stream you crossed going north is the same stream, the same cold water across the same smooth stones, but now it flows against the direction of your travel, and something about that reversal contains within it the whole enormous weight of the choice that has been made. The army that had walked north, dreaming of the Alps, walks south, carrying something more complex than a dream, a question, a reckoning, an acknowledgement that the world was not going to resolve itself as cleanly as any of them might have wished. But they were still an army, still formidable, still disciplined, still capable of things that Rome had not yet fully absorbed the lesson of. The fires in the evenings still burned bright and warm against whatever chill the season was beginning to offer. And around those fires, the same voices, the same languages braided together into something that resembled, if you closed your eyes and let the sound wash over you, a kind of improbable home. Spartacus walked among them, it is said, as he always had, neither distant nor diminished, still the steady center of something that the turning had not broken. Whatever he had hoped the north would give him, he carried it still. That hope, folded away somewhere internal, perhaps in the same place where a boy from the rolling hills of Thrace had kept the memory of open sky through all the years of enclosure. The road went south, the fires burned, and somewhere in Rome, a man named Crassus was beginning to think about walls and resources and the particular kind of patience that wealth makes possible. But that is something the night can hold quietly until tomorrow, turning it over slowly in the dark, like an ember that has not yet caught. For now, the column moves in firelight, and the stars are the same stars in either direction, and rest is close. The autumn had come quietly to Italy, as autumn so often does, not with a single decisive moment, but with a slow softening of the light, a gradual cooling of the air that moved down from the mountains in the evenings and settled into the valleys like something patient and inevitable. The leaves along the river margins were beginning to turn, pale gold and dusty brown, and the smoke from cooking fires drifted upward in straighter columns now that the summer winds had gentled and stilled. Across the long spine of the peninsula, from the northern plains still bearing the scars of recent marching, to the sun-bleached heel and toe of the south, Italy breathed in the particular way it does in that turning season, a held breath, a pause, as though the land itself were waiting to see what came next. In Rome, the mood was something darker than autumn contemplation. There was a heaviness in the city's great halls and colonnaded meeting places, a humiliation that had been building for nearly 2 years and that no amount of political language could quite disguise. The armies of the Republic had gone south to crush a slave rebellion, and they had come back diminished, embarrassed, stripped of their standards in some cases, their commanders filing reports that even the most sympathetic reading could not transform into victories. 2 consuls had marched their legions against the forces that had gathered under Spartacus and the other leaders on those volcanic slopes and open plains, and those consuls had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and sent home with their reputations fraying at the edges. Praetorian forces had fared no better. The story was always the same, a Roman force that ought to have won by simple virtue of its discipline and numbers, finding instead that the man they were fighting understood something about ground, about timing, about the way soldiers moved and tired and broke, that their commanders had apparently underestimated entirely. And so it was that Rome turned, in the way that Rome always eventually turned, when it needed something done with cold and comprehensive thoroughness, to Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was not a man who inspired the kind of easy affection that generals like Pompey seemed to collect without particular effort. Crassus was not warm in his public manner, not given to the gestures of popular generosity that made a man beloved in the forums and the streets. What he was, and what those who dealt with him closely understood with great clarity, was extraordinarily capable, extraordinarily patient, and possessed of a will that did not bend easily under pressure or embarrassment, or the ordinary discouragements that caused lesser men to revise their ambitions downward. He had made himself the wealthiest man in Rome through methods that were effective if not always admired, buying burned properties at ruined prices and rebuilding them, trading in slaves, lending money across the breadth of the city's commercial life. He knew how things were built and maintained and paid for, and he knew how organizations collapsed when the practical foundations beneath them were allowed to crumble away. He was given command of 6 new legions, and to the 4 legions already in the field, however battered their recent record, he added his own authority in something harder to name, an expectation of a different kind of discipline, a different quality of seriousness. It is said that with 2 of his officers led a detachment into a poorly chosen engagement and suffered a humiliating rout, Crassus carried out a punishment that had not been used by a Roman commander in living memory. He decimated that cohort, the ancient and terrible practice in which soldiers drew lots and every 10th man was executed by his own comrades. The story of it spread through the camps faster than any order could be delivered, and it spread further than the camps, reaching the roads and the farms and the distant fires of those who were watching Rome's military movements with careful attention. Whatever else might be said of what Crassus did, it communicated something with perfect clarity, that the calculations had changed, that the period of improvised and individually commanded Roman responses to the rebellion was finished, and that something more systematic and more pitiless had now taken its place. Spartacus and the forces with him had turned south again after the long argument and the reversal of the great march north, and they were in the deep south of Italy now, in the region of Bruttium, that long narrow peninsula that forms the toe of the boot, the place where the land narrows between the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas and the mountains press close on both sides of the coastal roads. The story goes that Spartacus had negotiations, or at least attempted negotiations with pirates from Sicily, hoping perhaps to move a portion of his people across the narrow strait to the island, where they might have found different ground, different possibilities. But the pirates did not deliver what had been agreed, whether from treachery or simple opportunism, or some shift in calculation that left the agreement dissolved, and the crossing did not happen. And so the army that had traveled so far, that had grown from a handful of men on a volcanic mountainside to something that had humbled multiple Roman forces in open field engagements, found itself pressed into that narrowing southern land with the sea at its edges and Crassus maneuvering behind it. It was then that Crassus undertook the project that would define how history remembered his campaign, the construction of what the sources describe as a great wall and ditch across the width of the peninsula, from one sea to the other. The toe of Italy is not wide at that point, something in the range of 30 to 35 miles across, depending on where exactly you draw the line, but 35 miles of fortification is still a vast undertaking, and what Crassus ordered was not a symbolic barrier, but a working military structure of genuine depth and solidity. A ditch, the ancient sources tell us, some 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, running for all those miles of difficult southern terrain, across hills and through valleys, and along the edges of the coastal ground. Behind the ditch a wall, high and reinforced, the kind of engineering that Roman armies were uniquely capable of when they committed themselves to earthwork, the same tradition of field fortification that had served Roman commanders across centuries and across every kind of terrain, from the Rhine marshes to the African desert. One can try to imagine what it was to build such a thing. The legionaries would have worked in shifts, the earth coming up in great dark loads from the cutting edge of iron tools, the soil of Bruttium piled and shaped and packed into the rampart that rose behind the deepening trench. Overseers moving along the line, checking angles and depths. The whole enterprise coordinated with the kind of systematic attention to detail that Roman military engineering at its best could produce. Day after day, week after week, through the cooling of that autumn season, the line grew. Fires burned along it at night, small and numerous, the light of them visible across the hills. A chain of orange points in the darkness that traced the shape of Rome's intention from one dark shore to another. It is said that Spartacus observed the construction of the wall and understood what it meant, which was not simply a barrier against movement, but a statement about time. Crassus was not in a hurry. Crassus had the resources of the Republic behind him, the grain and the timber and the iron and the endless supply of soldiers who could be rotated through the labor without depleting the fighting strength of the force. The wall said, with the patience of stone and packed earth, that the period of open maneuvering was over, that the space available to the rebellion was going to shrink and not grow, and that the long march and the great victories and the years of improbable survival were being answered now not with a better general and a fair fight, but with the weight of an empire that had decided to stop being embarrassed and start being final. The fires along the wall burned on through those autumn nights, steady and cold and purposeful, and across the line of that great ditch the fires of the rebel encampments answered them, closer now than they had ever been, the two sets of light regarding each other across the darkness of the Bruttian hills, like two thoughts that could not both be true at the same time. For now, though, the night holds both of them, the wall and those who wait beyond it, the smoke rising from both sets of fires into the same cool southern sky, the same stars moving overhead with their ancient and indifferent patience. The land breathes, the fires settle toward their embers, and the next part of the story waits, quietly, for another night to carry it forward. The river is running quietly tonight, as rivers do, indifferent to everything that has ever happened along their banks, carrying their cold water forward through the dark, as though history were only a passing shadow on the surface, soon gone, soon forgotten. The Silarus, which you might know today by the name Sel, flows through the plain of Campania in the south of Italy, and in the spring of the year that Roman historians would later record as 71, before the birth of Christ, its banks were crowded with the sound of men and the smell of fires and the particular heaviness that comes over a camp when something long held is finally, quietly understood to be ending. Spartacus knew, or so the sources suggest, that the army he had built across almost 3 years of improbable survival was not what it had been. The winter had taken much. The wall of Crassus had taken more, not in bodies necessarily, but in something harder to replace, that quality of belief, of forward motion, that had carried 70,000 or perhaps more across the whole length of Italy and back again. They had broken through the wall, that long, extraordinary earthwork stretching across the toe of the peninsula, and that breaking through had been a triumph of will and engineering in its own right, but it had not restored what the months of confinement had quietly eroded. The fires in the camp burned lower than they once had. The conversations between men were shorter. The laughter, which had once been real, was more effortful now, and yet there was something present in the encampment along the Silarus that was not despair. It is said that Spartacus moved among his people in those final days with a steadiness that those who remembered him would speak of long afterward. A quietness of bearing, a way of sitting with the fire at his back and listening to whoever came to him, that made the men around him feel, at least for those hours, that the ground beneath them was still solid, still worth standing on. He could not give them the Alps, which they had turned away from, or the ships from Cilicia, which had not come, or the open road to anywhere that was not enclosed by Roman legions, but he could give them his presence, and it is said that this was not nothing. Crassus was moving. Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had taken the command that no other senator had wanted, who had disciplined his own soldiers with the ancient and terrible practice of decimation to restore their will to fight, who had spent enormous sums from his own considerable fortune on this campaign. Crassus was bringing his legions up from the south and the east, and somewhere behind and to the north, the armies of Pompey were marching down from Spain, and Lucullus was coming by sea from the east. The net was tightening, and Spartacus, who had spent 3 years demonstrating the capacity to see the shape of things that his Roman opponents consistently underestimated, could see the shape of this very clearly. The question of why he chose to engage Crassus directly rather than attempt some further evasion has occupied historians gently ever since, and no certain answer has ever emerged from the ancient sources. It is possible that his men, after so long, could not have sustained another retreat. It is possible that he calculated the odds of slipping through were worse than the odds of breaking through. It is possible, though this is softer speculation, that he had simply decided that if this was to be the end, it would be an end of his choosing, on ground he had examined, in daylight, facing forward. Whatever the reasoning, in the spring of that year he drew his forces up along the banks of the Silarus, and he waited for Crassus to come. What happened next is preserved in fragments, Plutarch, Appian, others, and the fragments do not always agree in their particulars, as ancient sources so often do not. But the broad shape of the day is clear enough, and it is a shape that holds a certain quietness even in its violence. The way a storm holds quietness at its center, a stillness that is not peace, but is something like resolution. The battle was large. The Roman legions of Crassus numbered in the tens of thousands, and the rebel army, though reduced, was still a force of significant size, somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 men, or so the estimates suggest, though numbers from ancient battles should always be held lightly. The fighting, by all accounts, was fierce in the way that fighting is when men have nothing left to lose and everything still to prove to themselves. The rebel forces pressed hard against the Roman lines, and for a time, perhaps longer than Crassus had expected, they held their own. It is said that Spartacus, early in the battle, attempted to reach Crassus himself, cutting toward the Roman commander through the press of the fighting, that he killed 2 centurions who placed themselves in his path and came close enough that the attempt was real and not merely symbolic. But the press of men and the grinding arithmetic of the battle, Roman discipline, Roman numbers, Roman equipment, were not overcome that day, and the rebel lines eventually began to give. The end, when it came gradually rather than all at once. The way of fire does not go out in a single moment, but dims by degrees, one part of the flame surrendering before another, until what remains is embers, and then not even that. Units broke and scattered. Men ran toward the river, toward the hills, toward whatever space seemed open. The battle dissolved into something smaller, and then smaller still, until it was not a battle anymore, but only the sound of men moving through undergrowth in the growing quiet of the afternoon. Spartacus himself was not found among the living when the day was over. He was not found among the captured. His body, or what the ancient sources believed to have been his body, was never identified with certainty amid the dead, which lay across the plain in numbers that the sources estimate at enormous, perhaps 12,000, with very few of them, the historians note, wounded in the back. They had fought facing forward to the last. It is a detail that has been carried across 21 centuries without embellishment, because it requires none. Some escaped. In the days and weeks that followed, Smaller groups were hunted down across the south of Italy, by Pompey, by other Roman commanders, by the simple exhaustion of having nowhere left to go. 6,000, the sources tell us, were crucified along the Appian Way, that long road between Capua and Rome. One figure affixed to wood every few dozen paces for the entire length of it, so that travelers on that road would understand, for as long as the timber stood, what Rome did to those who broke from their place in the order of things. It is a fact that is difficult to hold for very long without needing to set it down. And so we set it down gently, and we let the road be quiet again, and we let the plain along the Silarus grow still, which it did, over time, as plains always do. The river continued running. It runs still, in some sense. The same water turning through the same lowlands, the same reeds bending at the edges, the same light moving across it in the early morning when the mist has not yet lifted, and the world is quiet enough that you might almost hear, if you were very still, the distant echo of everything that has ever happened along its banks. Not as a sound of grief, particularly, more as the river's way of remembering, not holding on, but not entirely letting go either. What had been built across those 3 years, the army from nothing, the alliances between peoples who had no reason to trust one another, the small governance of the camps, the carrying of the wounded, the debates around the fires, the women and children who had followed and been protected and had shaped the character of what the rebellion was, all of that dispersed now into the landscape of southern Italy, absorbed back into the ordinary life of people who survived by being unremarkable. Some were taken back into slavery, some perhaps walked into lives that left no trace at all in any record. The story goes that some found places where they were simply never found, and the fires along the Silarus went cold, one by one, as fires always do in the end, the coals darkening from red to gray, to something that the morning wind barely troubled, drifting, settling into the earth, becoming over a very long time indistinguishable from the soil itself. But the light of those fires, where it went, what it touched, what name it carried forward across the centuries, that is something the next chapter holds, waiting for you gently on the other side of sleep. The fire has burned low now, and the ash is pale and cool at its edges, and the road stretches away into the dark in both directions, and there is nothing left to do but rest. We have come a long way together, you and I, walking through the dust and the lamplight and the long green hills of a world that was ancient even when these things were happening, a world that has had 2,000 years more of wind and rain and slow forgetting since the last of these fires went cold. And yet something remains, something always remains, the way the smell of wood smoke clings to cloth long after the fire is out, the way a road worn deep by 10,000 feet keeps its shape in the earth for centuries after the last sandal has passed. The story of Spartacus is like that road. It holds its shape. It invites the traveler still. Let us walk it one more time tonight, slowly, with no urgency at all, with nowhere to arrive, only the soft pleasure of remembering. There was a boy once in Thrace, in the rolling country of the Mede, where the hills curved gently against a sky that was wide and pale in the early mornings and deep copper in the evenings, where the grass bent in long, slow waves when the wind came down from the mountains, where the horses were small and sturdy and warm to lean against on cold nights. We cannot know his name as a child, not truly, for history did not think to ask, but we can feel the shape of that childhood in the land itself, in the smell of damp earth and pine resin, in the sound of a river moving over stones in no particular hurry, in the weight of a first blade in a young hand, still surprising, still new. He learned what the land taught. He learned to read weather and clouds, to move quietly, to endure cold, to belong to something larger than himself, to the tribe, to the hills, to the long unbroken thread of people who had lived and died in that corner of the world for longer than anyone could count. And then Rome came. It came as it always came, not all at once but gradually, the way a tide rises, one rock submerged, and then another, until you look back and the shore you stood on is gone. The legions pressed into Thrace with their organized footfalls and their iron discipline, and their absolute certainty that the world was theirs to order, and the lives of people like the boy who had become Spartacus were folded into that certainty, whether they wished it or not. It is said that he may have served in Roman auxiliary forces for a time. That service and capture and the slow reclassification of a warrior into a slave may have happened in stages rather than all at once, though we cannot be certain, and history leaves us standing at the edge of that part of the story with only the wind for company. What we know is that the world narrowed, that a man who had known open sky and open country found himself chained, moving south through Italy on a road that grew hotter and dustier and more merciless with every day, passing through landscapes of olive trees and red earth and the distant shimmer of hills he did not know the names of, until he arrived at Capua, at the Ludus of Lentulus Batiatus, at a world of stone and sand and the smell of blood dried in the afternoon heat. The gladiatorial school was a world unto itself, and we spent a long quiet night inside it once, you and I, listening to its sounds, the shuffle of feet on sand before dawn, the ring of iron on iron, the low murmur of men speaking in languages that had no business being spoken in the same breath, Thracian and Gallic and Germanic, and the rough common Latin that became the lingua franca of the dispossessed. The smell of the place lives still in the imagination. Sweat and leather and the particular dry dust of the training ground and the oil lamps at night burning low in the cells, throwing long soft shadows on stone walls that held the warmth of the day long after dark had come. And in that compressed, airless world something grew. It grew the way things always grow in confined spaces, slowly and with great pressure, the way water finds every crack, the way a root splits stone given enough time and enough need. Friendships formed. Oenomaus, broad and steady and serious in his watchfulness. Crixus, all fire and restless energy, a man built for open fighting, impatient with walls. And others, unnamed in the sources, faces we cannot recover, but whose choices shaped everything that followed. The whispers passed from cell to cell in the hour before sleep, and the plan took shape the way plans always do among people who have nothing left to lose. Tentatively at first, and then with a gathering certainty that felt almost like calm. The escape when it came was rough and imperfect and human, nothing like the clean, decisive moments that stories tend to favor in the retelling. Kitchen implements and desperate speed, and the particular kind of courage that comes not from the absence of fear, but from deciding that fear is no longer the thing that matters. And in the open air, the road north to Vesuvius, the mountain rising dark and immense against a sky full of stars, offering itself as sanctuary without meaning to. The way wild places always do. On the slopes of Vesuvius there were fires. Real fires this time. Fires lit by free hands. And around those fires in the high dark night something extraordinary was happening. Something that had almost no precedent in the ancient world. An army assembling itself from nothing, from shepherds and runaways, and the people the empire had swallowed whole and half forgotten. They had almost no weapons. They had no supply chains, no officers trained in Roman military doctrine, no maps drawn by careful bureaucrats in Rome, and yet they built something. They built discipline. They built loyalty. They built across the seasons and across the landscape of southern Italy, victory after victory that left the Republic blinking in bewilderment and something close to fear. The marches north still feel vast and strange when you trace them with a finger on a map. The distances covered, the terrain crossed, the debates that must have raged around those nightly fires, about what the march was for, what the dream was, whether the Alps were truly a door that could be opened, or only another kind of horizon that would keep retreating as they walked toward it. It is said that Spartacus wanted to cross them, to send his people out through that narrow pass into their own skies again. The story goes that others refused, that the Gauls and Germans among the leadership wanted to stay and fight, to take the war to Rome itself, and that this disagreement, this irreconcilable difference of longing and strategy, bent the course of everything that followed. The return south was a different kind of march, and Crassus was waiting, patient and methodical and very rich, a man who understood that time and engineering and the systematic removal of options could accomplish what legions alone could not. The wall across the peninsula still impresses even in imagination. Miles of ditch and rampart cutting off the toe of Italy, a Roman solution to a Roman embarrassment. Massive and cold and oddly quiet in the way that very large structures often are, as if they have absorbed all the sound around them. And then the Silarus, and the last battle, and the end of what had been built. History does not tell us where Spartacus fell, not precisely, not with enough certainty to let us go there and stand on the ground and know. His body was never found or never identified, or was found and the finding was not recorded, and so he dissolves back into the landscape the way the boy from Thrace might have wished, becoming again just wind moving over grass, just smoke rising from a fire that has burned down to its last good heat. The road remembers, though. The roads of southern Italy are not the same roads, not the ancient paving stones themselves, though some of those survive, worn smooth by the weight of centuries. But the routes, the directions, the shapes of the land that determined where any army would have to go still exist, and the light still falls across the Campanian plain in the late afternoon the way it did then, golden and level and long, and the mountains still hold their shapes against the sky with perfect indifference to everything that has ever happened in their shadows. You have traveled a long way tonight, through 2,000 years of dust and firelight, and you can set the weight of it down now, gently, right here, and let the story go on existing without you for a little while, which it will, which it has been doing all along. Let your breathing slow. Let the images soften and blur at the edges the way the hills blur in morning haze. The rolling Thracian country, the dusty road through Italy, the dark slopes of the mountain, the fires burning low, the long road south through a world that was beautiful even when it was cruel, and all of it settling now into the quiet where remembered things go to rest. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are. The road will still be there tomorrow.